Hello, everyone who came to listen to a lot of information in a very unusual format. It's unusual for us, at least for us. It's the first time that we're organizing a webinar, and I hope that everything is okay from the technical point of view. And if someone hears me but cannot see, please contact my colleague Adele, who did all the registration, and you know her telephone number. It's in all of her letters. But if you can't hear me, of course, this information will not help. I am Dalia Bastytė. I work in Lithuanian Nature Fund, and I will help to moderate this event. We will have several presentations. First of all, I will read the presentation, and by the way, all presentations have been recorded because we were a little bit afraid of some internet problems. So nevertheless, each speaker will be able to answer to your questions, to respond live. So ask questions and go ahead, and the questions will arrive to my program. I will see all of them. And if there are so many questions, I will have to select some of them. And because of the shortage of time, and speakers will answer. So my first presentation, in order to introduce you to the project in the course of which we are implementing this webinar. And later on, we will start from conference presentation. Žydrūnas Preikša will speak about the importance of the Deadwood for biological diversity, and you will hear where 7,000 of diverse organisms hide and what to do in order to have more of them. And later on, we have several examples from abroad, from Latvia. Uldis Valainis will talk about old trees, inhabited by Osmoderma barnabita. And in the agenda, we had Jonas Hedin, but Jonas Alice couldn't participate, and he was substituted by Vikki Bengtsson. So Vikki will tell not only about the Swedish experience, but since she has so many years of experience of work with old trees, veteran trees, she will present different European examples of how people, are, what could be the mistakes, and how we should take care of the old trees. And later on, she will present the certification system developed by or on the topic, of the care of veteran trees. And finally, my colleague Alvydas Gintaras will present guidelines which we developed with respect to the management of deadwood and veteran trees in cities, in urban environment. And after that, we'll have a discussion. So I invite you ask questions even after each presentation, but in particular during the discussion. We really urge you to participate, those people who take care of urban forests, in particular municipal specialists, because I noticed many municipal specialists registered, and I'm so happy with that. It is great that you are so active. So let's start. With the first presentation, I will speak about the development of ecological network. I will present our project, and this distance conference is being implemented based on that, and this is development of ecological network of the mature trees dependent on and organisms which are dependent on them. And I'm head of this project. The purpose is to develop a functional ecological network intended for Osmoderma barnabita and other species which depend on mature deciduous trees. And why Osmoderma barnabita? Why? Because this species inhabits only in the high quality habitats, including other species. Therefore, we call Osmoderma barnabitas, as so to say ambassadors of other species which inhabit deadwood. Ecological network is being developed or is composed of the core zones and connective elements making corridors. Therefore, our task is to recreate habitats both in the core zones and also to develop connective elements and corridors, and also to recreate populations of Osmoderma barnabita in historical recreated habitats. Our key activities. There are quite many of those, and I could talk about each of them hours and hours, but I will just review briefly, and if someone is interested deeper, contact me and I will tell more. When we started implementing these activities, first of all, we wanted to find out the context. There haven't been too many researches with respect to Osmoderma barnabita. Therefore, we have chosen 50 areas, and we had no data on them, on types of habitats. We just saw something, based on the forest databases and main forest inhabitants, and that's all. We actually did not know what inhabited them, and therefore, we first of all went around and we looked at the place, we analyzed it during the winter time. And when we selected those which could be suitable for Osmoderma barnabita, so in summer we attached pheromones, special devices and boxes, and everywhere where we attached traps, we managed to collect some materials for genetic research. And then genetic research was carried out, and we used that data alongside with the data on habits, and also we carried out modeling using the habitats, also deciduous trees, and we created based on that the ecological plan. Here you see that map. In yellow, we signed, the places where we had our traps, and in green marked new finding places of the Osmoderma barnabita, which demonstrates the situation of how much it is spread in Latvia. This research has been carried out earlier. Therefore, we put all that together, and we made a plan of ecological network of 2 countries, which shows where or shows the locations of the ecological corridors, where is fragmentation, and which spots populations have been separated from each other. For example, genetically in northern Lithuania, Osmoderma barnabita, which inhabits, are closer to Latvian beetles, beetles living in Latvia, than to those which inhabit central Lithuania. Perhaps between the northern part and central part of Lithuania, we feel a very big shortage of the habitats and huge fragmentation. And so those beetles are distant from each other quite a lot. Therefore, when talking or thinking about connection, then these areas should be priority areas while developing such an ecological network. Since we used pheromones, catches, and traps, so we wanted to make them intelligent. And on the first picture, you see our colleague who is attaching a huge, a big trap, including the motion sensor, and so, it would respond to the trees, to every movement of the tree and everything else. And therefore, we selected a more simple example, quite a small, intelligent trap, which every hour sends data and pictures to our database, and researchers review them, and they see if the beetle has been caught. Therefore, there is no need to waste our time, fuel, and efforts. And then another category of activities is pursued between Kaunas and Vilnius. But first of all, we had to carry out, preparatory work. So we have identified 3 core areas: Neris Valley, Dūkštos ąžuolynas, and Kaunas Aukery, Dūkštos Aukery. And so we walked across these areas. We described them and made some conclusions of their suitability for the species, and also we evaluated the need for the care of the trees. And then we developed nature management plans for Kaunas Aukerį and Neries River Valley at the Verkiai, and Dūkštas has such a plan. It's in place, and based on those plans, having made the research and coordinate with institutions and the society, we can start carrying out the works. And we also prepared the guidelines on the management and care of giant trees and deadwood. And my colleague Gintaras will speak about that more. Now, while speaking about territories which connect protected areas, Kaunas Aukerį, Dūkštas Aukerį, and Neries Valley at Verkiais. So first of all, we had to establish which these territories are going to be. So we sat down at our computers and used all databases available, developed 3 scenarios, A, B, C. And then we started walking in the fields and evaluating which scenario could be better. We started from scenario A. We analyzed it, walked across and along. We made an inventory of 544 deciduous trees, bigger than 3 meters. And when we saw that this area is good for the ecological network because trees are quite close to each other. We said that one proper suitable tree must not be at a bigger distance than 1 or 2 kilometers. And so we found such trees and we described them. Then we chose these, which are priority trees, in which protected species can inhabit more than in other trees, and which have more hollows, more holes, and have more dead wood. And we assessed which need arboristic care or removal of the too big shadow. And then we had to collect agreements, permits, and consents from landowners, and we have to get them in writing. And where we also promised to carry out certain works, and landowners committed not to log the tree and not to harm it otherwise. So these are the works of management of the veteran trees. Of course, this is work with the tallow of the tree, and we could apply a reduction, pruning, and then people visited places. We, of course, reduce branches so that people feel safe and that those dry branches do not fall down. And sometimes, we remove other overshadowing trees because, old oaks, they grow, quite low and broad, and the young forest starts growing. And sometimes surrounding trees become higher, and they overshadow the old tree. Therefore, we offer to remove such younger trees, in particular from the southern side. Then there are cracks of trees, and we propose a dynamic connection or static even connections and mergers. And we clean, concrete from the hollows of the tree. And we clean, concrete from the hollows of the trees in order to avoid, humidity and mold. And if the tree, its roots were pressed, so we propose mulching and introduction of certain preparations. Here are works carried out in Kaunas Aukerį, and Alvydas, an arborist, is managing the tree. The tallow. At the present time, we are in the halfway in our work with the management of the trees. 9 trees in Neries Valley at Verkiai, in Dūkštas Aukerį 9, and Kaunas Aukerį 127 have been managed. And in the ecological corridors, 77 trees. Another interesting activity of ours is return of Osmoderma barnabita to the historical habitat. Such a habitat is in Strėvininkai, not far from Verkiai, and here during the recent 10 years, nobody managed to detect that beetle, and the habitat was managed. Conditions were very good, but, Osmoderma barnabita moves slowly. It doesn't like to move too much, and therefore It is a challenge to colonize this species, and we decided to help them a little bit. The first maneuver was not planned at all when the Stevninkai forest was locked out, so we detected that oaks have been locked. And the owner of this forest presented 4 trunks with cavities, with rot, and so we brought larvae to Verkei. We placed it not far from the valley of the river, and we created a certain monument to commemorate destroyed species, and we expected that something will appear in summertime, maybe our beetles. In 2019, beetles haven't appeared, not yet, or maybe we failed to catch them with our traps. And in 2020, they also avoided our traps, but one of our colleagues, when he came to check it, noticed that on the roof there were quite many beetles, and there were many of them, and part of them maybe will return back to mate, but the other part, since they were already on the top, we saw that they were ready to fly somewhere else, and they had some wings, and so it was quite good. And another work which was being planned in order to return back this rare beetle was related with the Lithuanian zoo. We are raising these beetles in these boxes. We use oak leaves, some rot, and we create a certain microclimate and temperature which reminds a cavity, a hollow of the old tree. And in the zoo, quite grown-up beetles are mated. In 2019, 15 beetles mated. And when we counted larvae, we found 324 of them. And half of them have been released to the valley of the Neris at Verkei in 2020. And these are boxes that we also placed on the Neris Valley, and these kind of boxes are 2.5 meters high, intended for 3 species. Through the slot that you see, bats could get inside. We expect they will inhabit. On the other side, we have holes, a hole for the birds. And the bigger part, the old bottom part, is full of, rot and the oak trees and special mixture, which is suitable for Osmoderma barnabita to live. And we will release our larvae to them. In 2020, in the zoo, 38 beetles have mated, and we are awaiting, for news. When we carry out an inventory of the larvae, we will know more. And also, as you know, while performing such an activity, information sharing is of great importance. Everything that we do, we plan to do. And what we did, we try all that, so to say, to convey to people through events, through TV programs, also information boards, at the objects that we erect, and we do our best that people understand what we do, and we're very glad with the attention that comes from the side of people, and we notice their sensitivity and their care with respect to trees, and we also try, them to inform as much as possible about measures implemented by us. The project itself is more than halfway, started in September 2017 and will last until March 2022. This is live nature project. The budget, as you see, is more than 1 million, and 74% is funded by European Union, 23 Ministry of the Environment, and the partners will fund the remaining part. And Lithuanian Nature Fund is a coordinating partner. We have associate partners that we work with, which is Daugavpils University Nature Studies Environmental Education Center, Lithuanian Zoo, Kaunas City Municipality and its administration.
Labą dieną. Aš esu Žydrūnas Preikša iš Vytauto didžiojo universiteto Žemės ūkio akademijos, aplinkos ir ekologijos instituto. Ir šiandien norėčiau aš pakalbėti apie negyvos medienos reikšmę biologiniai įvairoviai. Kaip žinoma, medžiai Žemėje atsirado daugmaž prieš 400 milijonų metų, jei lyginant su žmogaus homo genties amžius yra apie 2,5 milijono metų. Tai matote, evoliucijos laikotarpis medžių negyvos medienos yra žymiai ilgesnis. Pasaulyje yra sutinkama apie iki 1 milijono rūšių susijusių su negyva mediena. Tai sudaro apie 5 iki 10%, priklausomai nuo to, kiek mes skaičiuosim, yra Žemėje rūšių dalį. Kas tai yra negyva mediena? Tai galima išskirti tokias 6 kategorijas, tai sausuoliai, tai stovintys nudžiūvę medžiai, dar su viršūnė, stuobriai, tai stovintys medžiai su nulūžusiu, perlūžusiu kamienu, be viršūnės. Toliau virtėliai, tai gulintys ant žemės, nukritę medžių kamienai ar jų dalys. Toliau kelmai, tai nesvarbu, ar tai būtų žmogaus sukurti, tai yra nupjauti medžiai ir likę kelmai, ar tai natūraliai nulūžus medžiai šalia žemės, likę skaitosi iki pusės metro arba metro aukščio dalys. Taip pat gali būti sausos dalys ant žaliuojančių medžių, tai įvairios nudžiūvę šakos arba drevės, natūraliai susiformavę. Toliau gali būti sausos šaknys. Visumoje yra geriausiai ištirta pirmos 4 kategorijos, nes sausa šaknis yra ypatingai sunku tirti, jų nesimato. Ir sausas dalis irgi labai sunku, ant žaliuojančių medžių labai sunku apskaityti, nes jis irgi aukštai pakilę nuo paviršiaus, kai kurių patekimas yra gana sudėtingas ir tyrimai yra sudėtingi. Jeigu vaizduot patį medį, tai aišku, ant jaunų medžių negyvos medienos praktiškai nebūna. Kuo medis senesnis, to galima surasti daugiau įvairių dalių ant įvairių medžio vietų. Tiek apatiniai daly, tiek ant viduriniai lajos daly, tiek ir viršutiniai lajos daly. Čia ir matot įvairiausių variantų. Kaip gali būti piešinė, tą patį mes galim pažiūrėti ir mūsų Lietuvos seniausią medyje. Pastebėti, tai yra stelmužės ąžuolė.
Also in the very old tree of Lithuania, which is Stelmužė oak tree. It has been established that with most organisms related with Deadwood, mushrooms and insects. So we see types of mushrooms that dominate different types, like Dacrymycetales, and also insects like bees, ants, and etc. If we look at numbers, here we see examples taken from the Northern Europe, take Finland, Norway, and Sweden. Examples are based on these countries. So we see that they find around 7,500 species associated with Deadwood. Of course, these countries are bigger than Lithuania, but the geographical latitude is similar. If we take southern Sweden, so we can say that in Lithuania, this number would be similar. Out of all species, we can distinguish 2 types, obligatory and facultative organisms. What does it mean? Obligatory organisms mean that these are the organisms for which, Deadwood is mandatory. They cannot do without that, and they spend most of their time in it. And this is the foundation of their nutrition and multiplication. If, if we talk about facultative organisms, that means that for them, wood is not necessarily all over their life, maybe in certain periods of their life, but they do use it. Apart from something else, of course, but we have around 1,000 or above 1,000 in Fennoscandic region, and obligatory species boil down to 4,000, so quite big numbers, and other organisms, as you see on this chart. and not everything has been precisely identified, or those categories haven't been clearly defined. And if we see at the numbers, what is mostly recognized by people, of course, the vertebrates, but they make only 45 species, for only 45 species. Whereas all other organisms, like spiders, etc., 545 are difficult to see, or very good specialists are needed in order to recognize them. Well, speaking about importance of the protection of forest species in biology, so the most important are ancient forests, ancient rules, and also possibilities for the dissemination of the species, fragmentation, and the history of the forests. So history is quite recent when the fields are, cultivated. So trees could be 50, 100 years ago, and of course there can be already dead wood. But that doesn't mean that this dead wood is going to be very valuable and inhabited by many species. That depends a lot on fragmentation, on the spread possibilities, and of how long that forest existed, and if there are any other important areas from which species could appear. Of course, if we speak about forest and biological diversity, so the most important thing is, of course, primeval forest. It's like an most valuable area of the forest, primeval forest. But Alice, in Lithuania, also in Europe, we do not have many of them actually, and plain primeval forests not existing at all, maybe some remnants in the mountains or some other places which are difficult to access in the north. And the forests more remind parks, and actually, there is so little of dead wood in the areas which are farmed by farmers. Even such a mature beech forest doesn't exhibit features of the primeval forest, and we do not see any dead wood in it. Here we can say that here we do have, features, because we see big, big trees and some dead wood, although it is not a primeval forest at all. And this is how the primeval forest looks like in Czech mountains. It's a real primeval forest with big trees, a lot of dead wood, natural forest succession, different cavities, and the real mosaic. And here, the dead wood is one of the most important elements. If we take 100 years maple tree forest with the mature trees, we could find some rare species on the maple trees. But if we take 5 maple trees or 5 hectares of the same stand that we see, species will not be more. So the same number, will be repeating themselves of species. They will be, because there are no new substrates, no new deadwood. If we dry one maple tree, immediately a new influx of species will arrive related with deadwood, the so-called epixylic in forest biological diversity. If we speak scientifically, based on research and having access to all structural elements, so deadwood is the most important and crucial, I would say, for the protection of and preservation of biological diversity, in particular for rare species. If we look at the Red Book and its species, so those which are associated with the forest, we will see that the absolute majority of them requires, dead wood. And now about thresholds of the dead wood for different species. Different studies, scientific studies have been carried out. You see, different groups, of species, birds, and birds are also, divided to other species, also beetles of the wood, and these numbers are very different. If we take wood beets, we will see that 40 cubic meters per hectare, whereas for woodpeckers, some 10 hectares would be enough. But I have to emphasize that this woodpecker, doesn't care about fallen. So when we see 10 cubic meters, we have in mind, dry trees and fallen trees. And, beetles can live differently, but there is no one, so to say, integrated number. Whereas in Lithuanian research carried out in different mixed forests, we see, three systematic groups for lichen, moss, and mushrooms. Only core species were taken, and these are ancient forests. If we make an analysis, we see that above 100 cubic meters, when the volume of the wood is increased, species increase as well. Even a small increase in the quantity encourages species, but then time comes when the threshold is faced, and then the higher, the less species we see. So there are certain thresholds which exist, and even if we increase after or above this threshold, we will not have more species. This is a different analysis based on the same scientific research. When a certain limit or boundary is met, when the curve stops and there doesn't appear more species. And the size of the barrel is 20 yards, so we should multiply by 5 this number, and we will get around 100 cubic meters per hectare. So we can say that in Lithuania, broad-leaved deciduous forest, we should have about 100 cubic meters per hectare. But we speak only about large dead wood, excluding branches. And here we speak about fallen trees, and fallen trees here are most important. What does that mean? It means that if we had 1 cubic meters per hectare of the dead wood of different stages of rotting, starting 100 years ago, etc. So if we had that number, so then we could state that the danger that species would disappear is void. It's not in place, and they should survive. And there are different species of the mushroom, which you see in the picture, related with the dead aspen, And if we see, based on the analysis, we see all the facts based on the analysis. So if there were 10 cubic meters per hectare of the fallen aspen trees, so the possibility to detect such mushrooms is 75%. If 15 cubic meters per hectare, then the probability is 95%. So that we are going to detect it. But not all species are subject to that. For example, if we take this type of mushroom, Formitopsia rosea, associated with the deadwood of the spruce trees, so the probability is only 40%. If 100 cubic meters per hectare, then we will have 80% of the probability of finding that type of fungi. And even if we increase further on, the curve wouldn't reach 1, and so we would never have 100%. What does that mean? That means that for this fungi, for that species, not only that wood is very important, but also other factors, like environmental factors, which determine presence or absence of this fungi. Now, if we look at the quantities of dead wood in farmed forests across different regions, you see the numbers. In Lithuania, around 10 cubic meters in farmed, of course, forests, excluding reserves or actually nature strict reserves, and less in other countries, and big quantities in tropic forests in Australia. And we can say that also in other places as well, where forests haven't been touched by humans, or where very, very huge trees grow. And even one fallen tree can have a big, big, enormous volume of dead wood. If we speak about natural forests, fluctuation is from 20 to 1,220 in northern boreal forests, where trees usually are small because of their cold climate, slow growing, etc., and one cannot find big trees, whereas 1,200 could be found in sequoias forests. But in any case, if we said before that, or talked about 100 cubic meters per hectare, so in farmed forests, these numbers are in particular low, and we are very, very far away from that number. One thing is quality or qualitative parameters, but the other thing, which is no less important, an important parameter is related with the quality, which determines the stage of rotting, of rot, to which extent, this fallen tree has been rotted. And here, by different stages of rot, we use 5 scales. In the first scale, the first score are fresh fallen trees, whereas the fifth stage are fallen trees that are really, highly rotten. And if we speak about the rare species, so for them, average rot stages are most important. The second, third, and fourth. And on them, most rare species could be detected. And based on the chart, we see that, for some reason, 42% belong to the first stage, as if more than others. But we have to bear in mind that on the first stage, also epiphytic species are found, which grow on still green trees. So when trees fall down, they still remain and survive. And then when they rot further on, the bark falls down, branches fall down, and these species disappear. And only then, deadwood-related epixilic species appear. As here, third stage, the average stage of rot, when the heart of the tree is already rotten, or the fourth stage. This is how fallen trees look like. Another thing is how do organisms develop. If the tree falls down, of course, the initial colonizers appear. They colonize the tree, and they can live already in dead wood, which are related with it, and which are not yet met on the green trees. However, when the tree rots, other species appear which haven't been on the first stages and which need softer wood. And there are more specialized species. And if that is the middle stage, more than 10 years, of course, that depends on the venue, on the location, on the species of trees. Some rot faster, some slower. But the most important thing is that in those middle stages, we detect the most rare species. And their diversity is the biggest diversity, because in the middle stages, one can meet both first colonizers that remain and the later ones, which come from, and these are the succession stage species. If we look by categories, so which is the most important category where species are most abundant? So we see that, of course, fallen trees distinguish themselves. Others are more or less equally important. If we speak about the size of that substrate or that wood, the quantity, so all categories, again, are mostly related with the fallen trees. Why? Because if the fallen tree, you can understand easily that such a fallen tree, of course, rots much, much slower than smaller branches, and those species can remain and survive much longer. And if even if some fungi species appear on those smaller branches, that branch would rot soon and those fungi would not be able to multiply and would disappear. As such, fallen trees are much more important because and they possess many more species. If we take one example, an oak tree, it can stand for 500 years as a green oak or an oak which is green in part, and several more ages as a dry tree, and then 100 more as a fallen tree, and the entire age would be 1,000 years or above. And whereas in farm forest, we destroy everything and we just leave the number 120 years because the age of logging is 120. So we destroy 900 years of the existence of the oak trees, and together with all very important and rare species, and evolution is, so to say, terminated. This is how 120 years oak looks like, and in fact, no rare species could be found in it. But if we don't log, if we double the age of the tree up to 220 years, then we might have better results. And so this is how that tree looks like. Some branches already dry and fallen, and some cavities could be formed. And here, in this case, we would find quite many species, lichen, fungi, insects, beetles, and also woodpeckers, for which such trees with cavities are so important. But if we leave the tree, if we keep it more and longer, up to 500 years, so this is how they would look like. And the oak tree has changed even more in comparison with the previous one that we have, and some can be already perished, but some branches may be still green, and there appear entirely different species which were absent on the younger versions. And I can provide you different examples like stag beetles that we don't meet anymore. This is so because we don't have too old trees, or even if there is one or two trees are not enough for the existence of the species. How does the deadwood appear? In temperate forests, in the middle, so to say, latitude, in the mixed forests, there appear single trees or some groups of fallen trees. Maybe because of, not because of the wind or fire. If we take boreal forests, or there, winds and fires are most important factors. And the forests are really breached a lot, and they can be harmed, and a lot of dead wood would be formed. And also some beetles are important. They speed up the process, and fungi, even beavers. And other natural factors. Microhabitats. We speak about still standing and green trees. Microhabitats are very important. These are the most crucial places for rare species to survive. And we see many examples of those species, most diverse. And there can be different crevices or cavities and holes, and each of them will hold different species. Diversity of microhabitats is also big. Related with thunder, with the factors of thunder created by woodpeckers and naturally formed. Diversity is really big, and there is also a big, rich diversity of species. And for the end, I have a historical question: what is more important to preserve, 2,000 years Coliseum or 500 years old oak tree? Of course. One is cultural heritage, the other heritage of nature. So the answer would be that yes, we should protect both. Nothing should be destroyed. But the essence is that if we destroy a Colosseum, we can rebuild it. If we have money, we can raise money quite quickly and rebuild it. And whereas we will never be able to rebuild an oak tree. And as Lao Tzu, the ancient Chinese philosopher said, life and death are one thread, two faces of the same sinew. And here we have another problem that we still can find such stumps, which mean that oak trees several hundred years old were logged and entire biological diversity was destroyed. And therefore, while doing that, we cause huge harm. And it's a pity, of course, and we destroy species ourselves. And I mentioned the species dependent, on such trees like the stag beetle. Thank you very much for listening to me. And now I would invite you to ask questions, whereas I found another question for the previous speaker, Martina. What about the box attached to the tree, for Osmoderma barnabita? And is there any harm caused by doing that? But of course, you will see, for the Swedish example, and being attached to the trunks with saps, etc., to the trunks of the big trees. Not when we did that in Verkey, we took into account specificity of the venue. And you could see in the picture like legs, supports from the sides, and that box is standing on those supports on the surface of the ground. It's not dug into the ground. And you know that it is full of humidity and leaves, etc. But those legs, those supports are sufficient, and that it doesn't cause any big influence on the environment, on the tree itself. And there was another question of the administrative character. Will there be a recording? Yes, we will do. We will have a recording, on our website, Osmoderma _LT, and so you will be able to access the record. And now I'm looking at the questions to Žydrūnas. Martina asks, but I would like to encourage also others that you ask questions and write. I will read them out. So Martina asks Žydrūnas, how should we assess deadwood, for example, dry woods in the cities, in the urban environment? How to evaluate it? First of all, we should consider locations where if there are some dangerous places in the parking lots or close to the residential houses where they can cause harm to safety. They should be removed, but not to wait until they become very valuable. The recently dried tree, could be removed. But even if that city is in the city or in the park, distance from the walking paths or from the buildings, I think that such trees could be left. And we have many examples how big trees, huge trees, they are standing in the cities. And even branches are not locked, just signs attached that it's dangerous and people should be careful. And there's no need to walk under the tree. There are information tables and notices attached and in the form of the warning. And so people shouldn't walk under such trees and should keep distance. Thank you very much, Žydrūnas, for your answer. I see another question. Do all trees, veteran trees in the cities are of the same value as in the forest? Are micro conditions, suitable for rare fungi. Trees are valuable, but of course in the forest we would find more species. With respect to fungi, that would be the same because the substrate is most important thing for the fungi. And if it is suitable, yes, fungi will be growing irrespective of the city or forest. But we should miss some lichen, of course, in the cities because lichens respond to the pollution of the air, and conditions wouldn't be good for the lichen to reside and for birds. But it depends on the situation. The same applies to the beetles. Illumination and conditions are very important. But if they are good and favorable, unless very, very polluted, they could be favorable also for these. Thank you very much for your answer. So far, I don't see more questions, and now I would like to invite the next speaker, Uldis Valainis from Daugavpils University Nature Sciences from the Education Center.
Hi everybody, my name is Uldis Valainis, and together with my colleague Maksims Balalaikins, I represent Daugavpils University Nature Studies and Environmental Education Center. It is pity that the event cannot take place in the usual format, but in any case we are glad that such an event is being organized. The title of our presentation is The Hermit Beetle in Urban Areas, a compromise between the interests of society and nature protection by the example of Latvia. And given the concentration of economic interests in urban areas, it is very difficult to ensure the long-term protection of nature values in these areas. Hermit beetle is one of the species that requires a special approach, as the protection of the species requires old hollow trees, which are often considered potentially dangerous and at risk of felling. And Osmoderma barnabita is an Eastern European species that is also found in Latvia. This species is particularly vulnerable to the loss of broad-leaved veteran trees, as its larva requires tree cavities. Due to the low dispersal capacities, Osmoderma species are considered as one of the most threatened invertebrates in Europe. And according the report under Article 17 of the Habitats Directive, for the previous period, it's from 2013 to 2018. In Latvia, conservation status of this species assessed as unfavorable bad. The trend in conservation status in Latvia population is reported as unknown, and currently known hermit beetle localities in Latvia are shown on the map. A lot of the hermit beetles findings are associated also with trees growing in villages, towns, and cities. For example, alleys and rows of trees near the roads or parks and greeneries. And hermit beetle, like other species associated with the tree cavities, is most threatened by the felling of old trees. Given that this species occurs mainly in the open landscape, we would like to pay attention in the presentation to the most important, in our opinion, legislation acts that regulate the procedures for felling trees in non-forest lands. In these regulations included restrictions for tree felling, promote the conservation of old hollow trees also in urban territories. And the most important rules are regulations on tree felling in non-forest lands. These rules are binding for felling trees in all non-forest territories. In some areas, in addition to these regulations, other restrictions on tree felling may be determined. Special regulations are developed for protected dendrological plantings and protected alleys. If hollow trees are located in a protected nature area, then should be taken into account general regulations on protection and use of special protected nature territories. And hermit beetle is one of the species found in Latvia for the protection of which microreserves can be established. There are special regulations developed regarding this, and several micro reserves established in Latvia for the protection of hermit beetles are located also in urban areas. Specific restrictions for tree felling can be included also in regulations made by local government, and also individual regulations for protection and the use of territory may be developed for specially protected areas. Now about some restrictions for tree felling in regulations on tree felling in non-forest land. And according this, landowners need permission from the municipality for felling trees outside the forest if the trees has reached 20 centimeters in diameter. And if it grows in the territories mentioned in this slide, for example, cities and villages, parks, etc. And broadleaf trees that reached such size in diameter are generally not yet suitable for the species occurrence, but the conservation of these trees could be important in the context of the species' future habitats. So it must be taken into account in conservation. If circumference of the trees exceeds the dimensions specified in appendix of these regulations, then a municipal permit for felling the trees is required, regardless of the place where the tree grows. If we look on native tree species, which is most potential microhabitats in Latvia for hermit beetle, then we see that, for instance, determinate circumference for oak is 2 meters and 40 centimeters. Oaks that have reached such dimensions, such size may already be suitable for the hermit beetle. And the regulations describe also exceptions when the permission of the municipality for felling trees is not necessary. Without a municipal permit, it is allowed to fell trees that endanger the infrastructure, human health, life, or property. And before carrying out the tree felling, the situation must be photographed, and the municipality must be informed about tree fellings. And how municipal specialists can assess the negative impact of each tree felling on nature values. So Nature Conservation Agency developed special natural data management system where is accumulated all information regarding protected species and habitats, as well as nature protected territories. And if protected species or habitats have been registered in the area where tree felling is planned, then the local government consults with the conservation agency, which decides on the need to involve species or habitats experts. The example shown in the screenshot is very well studied micropopulation of the hermit beetle. It is in Ungurmuiža. All known localities and potentially suitable trees for the occurrence of hermit beetle here are mapped. And it should be noted that such studies have not been carried out for most areas, and the amount of data available usually is much smaller. However, developed natural data management system usually help institutions in decision making and also helps experts in their work. Latvia has also developed special regulations where procedures for the certification of experts in the field of conservation of species and habitats is definite. And the Nature Conservation Agency administers the register of nature expert, which is public and available on the website of the Nature Conservation Agency. You can see it on the screen. It covered some sensitive data on the slide. If someone needs the conclusion of a certified expert, he can find all necessary information in this register. So what is the requirements for expert conclusions? Requirements for expert conclusions has been determined also by special regulations shown on this slide. In the middle of the current slide is shown an example of expert conclusion. It's of course it's only first page of conclusion. It is the invertebrate expert conclusion on the management of hermit beetles microhabitat, an old oak in Zaube village. Picture you can see on the slide. And the local government engaged expert in the planning of management measures here. And it's very positive example for experts' work because the experts' conclusion has been requested only on the management of the one oak as hermit beetle microhabitat, but taking into account that there are also trees suitable for hermit beetle occurrence in the surrounding area, the expert has assessed all potentially suitable trees in this area. The expert has developed individual recommendation for each of the existing and potential habitats of these species, taking into account the interests of the landowners, technical possibilities, ownership of the land, and other factors. In this slide, you can see the area where are hermit beetle localities, also potential habitats and other species located. For example, Protetia lugubris. According to the regulations, experts' conclusions must be supplemented also by photos from the surveyed area, as it is shown in the slide. And to expert conclusion, attached cartographic material were shown trees to be preserved according the expert's conclusion, the trees to be felled, as well as the trees which can be managed only with involving an invertebrate expert in order to reduce the possible negative impact of management on hermit beetles micropopulations. And in accordance with the expert's recommendation, site management measures have been taken by a local municipality You can see this territory after the management works done. An information board about the hermit beetle is installed also near the Zaube oak. Here is another example from different territory. Is Jezupova Park, which is located in the southeast part of Latvia. Infrastructure improvement works were planned in the park, within the framework of which it was planned to fell dozens of trees, and given that hermit beetle inhabited trees are represented in the park, and an invertebrate expert was involved in the process, as well as a dendrologist for assessing the vitality of the trees. And involved experts prohibited the biggest part of planned trees felling. The municipality took into account the recommendations of experts, and only some life-threatening trees were felled. Jezupova Park is still suitable habitat for the occurrence of hermit beetle. Some weeks ago, a special art object devoted to the hermit beetle was set up in the park. You can see the picture in the slide. And the municipality also organized different events in the park, including events about the natural values found here. For our opinion, this is also a very good example, which shows that in situations when in decision making is involved the municipality, the nature conservation agency, and the nature experts, it is possible to preserve hermit beetle habitats also in urban territories. One more example on trees management in urban territories. This slide shows another positive example of hermit beetle suitable habitat management from Augšlīgatne. Professional arborists have been involved for trees crowns managing. The branches of life-threatening tree have been cut off, leaving the trunk standing in the environment. And it is very attractive place in terms of biodiversity and also aesthetically. Next example is from Jaunpils Park. Trees crown management was done. The wooden arbor was built in the park. Is built between the trees on screw piles. Also, sheep grazing. Sheeps graze in the park. What is not very typical situation in Latvian parks. In Latvia, special regulations have been developed to ensure the protection of large old trees. According to Latvian legislation, protection is provided for all trees that have reached a certain size. In accordance with these regulations, protected trees in Latvia are defined as nature monuments. It is like a small nature protected area which includes protected tree and the territory around the tree in the area of crown projection, as well as 10 meters wide zone around it. The regulations define the circumference and length of the tree, reaching which the tree qualifies for the status of the protected tree. It is enough to reach one of the definite criteria. And if we look on native tree species, which is most potential habitats for hermit beetles, then we see that, for example, in the for example, for oak is 4 meters. For maple, ash, and lime trees is 3 meters and 50 centimeters. Upon reaching such dimensions, the trees are considered to be protected trees. Many of these trees are localities of hermit beetles, and conservation of such trees is very important. And also many of these trees grow in urban areas in Latvia. This slide is show example of protection measures of protected tree in Ventspils port. A fence has been created around the buffer zone of the protected tree to ensure the preservation of the tree during construction works. So, due as the fact that large hollow trees can cause threat to human safety, not all trees can be preserved. And here is an example from Jelgava city. In 2019, the cutting of a protected oak in the Jelgava city gained a wide resonance, and the expert recommended preserving the tree and provides instructions for oak management measures. But in winter, tree management, when tree management is started, during this management activities was established that it is impossible to preserve the tree. The permission of the Nature Protection Board was received for felling of tree. There are experts who believe that it was still possible to preserve the tree. This shows that each such case needs to be carefully assessed. In any case, it is positive that the tree stump and trunk were preserved in the environment. Of course, it has less ecological function than living wood, but it is better than removing them at all. In accordance with regulations on protected alleys, there are 64 protected avenues in Latvia, and tree felling in protected alleys is allowed only if the tree has become dangerous, threatens road traffic or people safety, and there is no other alternative to prevent the dangerous situation. And written permission from Nature Conservation Agency is required. And locations of protected avenues in Latvia is shown in right side of the screen. There are also another regulations for protected dendrological plantings. There are 89 protected dendrological plantings in Latvia. Most of the protected dendrological plantings are old manor parks, which can be located also in urban territories. Manor parks are considered to be a very important area in terms of biodiversity, as also suitable habitat for hermit beetles. Tree felling and regeneration of dendrological plantings shall be permitted in accordance with the protected dendrological plantings reconstruction projects. And it must include inventory of dendrological plantings and nature values, as well as development of management and recommendations. Here you can see example of reconstruction project. Yes, and this developed reconstruction project from Jaunsvente park has been approved also by the local government construction board, despite that the regulations do not include such requirements, and part of the works planned in their construction projects has already been implemented. As I mentioned, hermit beetle is one of the species for the protection of which micro-reserves have been established. In total, there are only 8 micro-reserves in Latvia created for the protection of hermit beetle micropopulations, and the total area of these micro-reserves is only 18 hectares. Micro-reserves may be established also in alleys, parks and squares, in villages, towns and cities. In the right side of the slide is shown hermit beetle micro-reserve in Riga city. The tree felling or other actions in such micro-reserves can be done only in accordance with conclusion of a certified invertebrate expert. So conclusions, Latvian legislation is considered to be suitable regarding the protection of existing and potential hermit beetle habitats in urban areas. The biggest problem in the legislation of Latvia is about the tree felling outside forest. Is not with the shortcomings of policy, but the lack of policy compliance. Non-compliance of legislation is usually linked to a lack of knowledge of general public and stakeholders about nature values. Therefore, it is very important to educate all citizens about the importance of old hollow trees in the preservation of biodiversity and the necessity to protect them. Stakeholder decisions on tree felling are often based on considerations that felling is cheaper than providing the necessary long-term management of the trees. And most of the human life-threatening trees in the urban areas in Latvia have become such due to the result of insufficient tree management. So some examples from public education campaigns in Latvia about the importance of old hollow trees in the nature. And the pictures is shown some examples where the main actor of these campaigns was hermit beetles. So thank you for your attention, and special thanks for nature experts Mārtiņš Kalniņš and Guido Leiburgs, who shared with us their experience of hollow trees management. Thanks.
And now we will listen to Vikki Bengtsson's presentation.
Good morning. My name is Vikki Bengtsson. I'm an ecologist and I work with nature conservation and have worked with issues regarding ancient and veteran trees for almost 30 years. I come from Scotland originally, but have worked around about half of my career in England, and the last 17, 18 years I've been based in Sweden, but work in several countries across Europe with regard to the management of ancient and veteran trees. So I consider myself very lucky. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about ancient trees in urban areas, problems, opportunities and solutions. And some of the examples come from Sweden, but some come from other countries as well. I know you were expecting to be listening to Jonas Hedin, but unfortunately he's unable to be with you, so I've taken his place. So this is a beautiful avenue from a place just near to Stockholm, where it's wonderful old ash pollards in the grounds of an estate, which is also a sixth form college. So today or this morning, I want to talk to you about several different things. Briefly, I want to talk about why trees can live so long. It's one of the things that fascinates me. I think already you'll have heard about why they're so important, but I'll touch on that briefly. Then it's a little bit about where they are, because that's really crucial to dealing with the problems and the solutions. And then finally, I want to talk a bit about, give you some examples of different things and ways trees have been managed in these slightly more challenging environments. So I always like to bring up the issue of tree time when thinking about working with old trees, that in our lifetime, when we're working 40, 50 years perhaps at best, and an old oak tree has hardly come out of puberty by that time if it's germinated at the same time as we started working. And this tree is a fabulous example of that, because if we were to look at that tree in 1910, which is when the first photograph was taken, and then again look fast forward to 2009 and the photograph of the same tree, I wonder how many of us would have guessed that that's actually how it would look after 100 years. And I think it's a wonderful example of trees and their resilience, and their change over time is extremely slow, and that we need to take that into account when managing them. And the fact that trees can reinvent themselves, so they have the ability to produce new shoots, new leaves, new branches from basically any of their living tissue. And they can reduce their crowns, they can increase their crowns, they can renew their crowns, they can do the same in the root system. And it's a wonderful capacity, which means that they can both adapt to their environment, albeit slowly, but they can also go through periods of reiteration and renewal. And it means they, in essence, could potentially live forever. Now, we know that they don't, but they have that capacity. And I think that's very humbling and should be something that we take account of always when working with our veteran trees. So I think you've already heard the value. They're like living blocks of flats. They house a huge range of organisms, much of which we're only just scratching the surface in terms of understanding. And I've just a few photographs here of a fungi, a lichen, and a stag beetle. And this is a tree that's protected in Sweden and contains all of these species. And that's just, I love that fact that we're still learning so much about our old trees. And each individual is exactly that. It's an individual, but it also hosts a variety and different range of species. And an old oak can host a whole range of species. So, I mean, one individual may have 200-300 species, but they can have the potential to host up towards 1,000 different species, at least in Sweden and in much of Northern Europe. And I think you've maybe already much about hermit beetle. We know that 80% of European saprophytic beetles are threatened. They're the most threatened species community in Europe, and many of those are associated with old trees. So, and that figure has gone up in terms of numbers. It was 11% when the last IUCN report was taken. So that really shows us that we've got a lot of work to do to ensure the survival of the old trees that we have left in our landscape, but also ensure that we have old trees in the future. But then I don't think we should forget that old trees also have an important cultural context, a heritage value, that they tell us something about our past and they connect us to our past. So the tree you can see on the right is called kvilleken or rumskulleken, and that tree is about 16 meters round. It takes more than 10 people to join hands and circle that tree. It's probably towards 1,000 years old. It has a fabulous history, what that must have seen. And then the tree on the left is from Windsor in England and has a similar age, probably, although we can only really guess at the age because the trees are very hollow. But when you just begin to imagine that the kings and queens that have ridden past that tree, that have fought wars or hidden from enemies, and I think that's one of the things we often forget, is that old trees, they create a sense of well-being, they create a sense of stability and a sense of history. And we mustn't underestimate that, particularly in our urban environments where people are. So where do we find our old trees? Well, originally, probably most of them were in what we might call wood pastures or wooded meadows with grazing animals and not a house in sight. But today, we know that many of our old trees are actually close to people. They're in more urban environments, and avenues are the classic example of that, whereby they can be in the middle of cities, they can be obviously out in the countryside as well, in estates or more formal landscapes. Churchyards, I'm not sure of your history that you have with regard to churches and trees, but in Sweden, trees were planted in a ring around the churchyard in order to keep away evil spirits, but also to create solace. And they're extremely important. And then in the UK, we have yew trees that are often in relation to churchyards. So it's an area where we have often many old trees. But then, of course, we have them, squeezed in amongst other things, amongst the urban environment. And I love this photograph, oak tree garage. And here is the oak tree full of concrete. And you wonder how long this oak tree will actually last in relation to a garage, which must be full of all sorts of horrible things that are getting into the roots. And you wonder really where the roots are, in fact, because there's very little area whereby water might get through. But it's often the case that we have old trees remaining in development areas where potential conflicts develop. There are conflicts in relation to development. The picture on the left is from Belgium, whereby you can see that the fence is just way too close to the tree. The picture on the right is from some work that was being done in a churchyard in Sweden, and you can see that trees don't have roots according to this picture, because a fence has been put up around the stem, which is great because it avoids damage there. But I find it very commonly the case that in urban areas, people just forget that trees have roots. Then there can be other issues like felling. And felling and inappropriate management is much more common in urban areas than it is out in the countryside. People have much greater risk aversity, so they're afraid that trees are going to fail. Then we have vandalism, which is also an issue much more common in urban environments. But then we can't forget tree diseases, because tree diseases have an impact on how people perceive trees. And we've got more and more tree diseases that are coming to Europe, and that in combination with climate change mean potentially that we've got more to deal with, and that's a threat. It's a threat to all veteran trees regardless of where they occur, but it's certainly something perhaps that's more obvious and acute in the urban environment. So there are conflicts between users, as I've mentioned. A good friend of mine who gave me this photograph here, Ted Green, he talks about cars being attracted to trees because that's where there's shade. And so, of course, when we park our cars, we want to find a bit of shade if it's sunny weather, but that can lead to all sorts of problems. You can see that the tarmac's all cracked here from the roots. And these things kind of develop slowly, that suddenly, people were parking under the tree and somebody thought, oh, well, we better put tarmac down. And then the tarmac comes and then the tarmac breaks up. And then the whole cycle, if you like, of decline for that tree will develop. And then you have risk. I think that's one of the biggest concerns that I often have with regards to management of old trees, is that we perceive them to be high risk. But then, of course, it can be conflict between users. So we've, on the picture on the right here, we've got the power lines, we've got the car, we've got the signposts, and all of that means that the space the tree can take is reduced. So how can we help to deal with this? Well, the common suggestion is to put up a fence around the trees, because that deals with several problems. It stops people getting in too close. It reduces potentially the option of having to do pruning on the tree, and it allows still people to appreciate it. But in this case, this was a tree that was so popular. It's called Druid's Oak, and the tree had a fence put around it, but then people walked around that fence. You can see here on the picture that the desire line, the footpath where people went, and actually this is where all the fine roots were, which meant that the tree actually declined more in health when the fence was put up. So it became clear that a new fence needed to be put up and extended further out, and the area was then mulched within that area. And now people can still really enjoy the tree still, but without causing any damage. So fencing is sometimes a good option. A boardwalk is another one. There's a tree in Belgium where they've created a beautiful boardwalk which allows people to get relatively close to the tree but without damaging the roots. But then I think the thing that I think is most obvious to deal with regard to old trees is moving the problem. Now, I say these two were messing about on a bench under a huge, large old branch that you can see above their heads. And I don't know how many conversations I've had with people about how shall we prune this branch? What shall we do? We never discuss about moving the bench. And actually, that's a much simpler, cheaper operation. You don't have to come back. You do it once and the job's done. So I think that's something we need to be much more conscious about. It's an opportunity, I guess, in the urban area for us to actually think about what's under the trees and in close proximity to the trees and actually move them rather than undertaking pruning on the trees. But this is one of the areas as well where safety then becomes an issue, that we don't look at moving the bench, we look at pruning the tree from a safety point of view, and it becomes this vicious circle of potential decline, and eventually the tree will suffer and go. This is another example. This is where a tourist train went along this track, beside this tree. This is a very old sweet chestnut that's also surrounded by beech and was suffering from shade. And I think this is a wonderful example whereby you can make the story of this particular tree that is one of the oldest in the area. Now, we often laugh in Belgium that they don't have many old trees left. They almost know them all by name. And that means, though, that there's extra care taken potentially with those trees that they have left. So they were able to divert the tourist train. They were able to get some more money when the awareness was raised about it and clear some of the beech, from around that tree. So that's a really nice, positive story. And then vandalism, which was one of the other problems that I mentioned. This is a tree, the Prince Eugene oak in Stockholm. And this tree has had everything done to it you can possibly imagine, but in order to save it. And I think it's a wonderful story. And it's also a bit of a reflection of the history of arboriculture. It's got, you can't see, but there's a cable attaching, I think it's just there. There's a cable attaching the branches to a big rock, a big boulder here on the side, in order to keep the tree up. I think there was a worry it was splitting. And then this is a huge cavity where someone had set fire to it, but luckily they managed to get it out before it did any damage to the tree. But now they've done this beautiful construction of covering the cavity, not so that insects can't get in, but just so that people can't get in and undertake the damage. And then they've covered it so carefully with oak bark to try and make it look more natural. And I think it's just it's very interventionist, and that can be a philosophical discussion, but this tree is loved and it's taken care of in an urban situation. And there's a story behind it as well, which I think also evokes interest from people. But I think the thing that we mustn't forget is old trees need space. And even with the best of intentions, you can end up with a situation where conflict arises. And this is an example from a housing estate where it was an old wood pasture with lots of old oaks. And the white house in the photograph shouldn't have been built according to the original plans to give this oak tree a bit of space. But for whatever reason, a house suddenly appeared there. And the tree's got some space. It's certainly better than it might have been. But the problem we have is the people who live in the White House, their bedroom window is up there on the upper floor, and the branches from the oak tree scratch the window. So you can imagine when it's a windy day, they don't get a lot of sleep. So they're ringing up the local council and complaining about this oak tree. And I guess this is the real thing that I would stress, is that the importance of planning and the importance of giving the trees space. If you want to keep them, and we want everyone to do that if it's possible, you need to ensure there's adequate space for the tree to continue to survive. Because if there isn't, then the tree is probably, its days are numbered. This particular oak tree has now had a pruning done of it because the neighbours were complaining. They were already complaining about all the oak leaves that are messing up the front and so on. And I mean, I'm sure you all have this kind of experience. And this is a lovely example, I think, of where an oak tree wasn't given a lot of space in a car park. It was given some space, but it really was in severe decline. And it's part of a bigger wood pasture landscape. And ironically, this car park is visitors to this lovely wood pasture landscape, which is just near a town. So this construction was created around the base of the tree that you can see here, and it was filled with wood mulch, and this is kind of well composted wood mulch, 4 or 5 centimeters deep, and the tree has really come back. And also what's lovely, I think, is that people are interested. It looks more formal and it looks looked after, and people take much more care. Before, this ground here, people parked their cars under it because there was nothing to stop them from doing it, even if the tarmac was here, because when the car park was full, they just parked under the tree, and here was some shade as well, as I've mentioned earlier. So I think this is a really lovely way of helping ensure that a tree can survive and has the space it needs, plus and is retained. And this is a really lovely story because the tree's now in really, really good condition. Then there's this other issue of safety and risk, which is a common one that we all have to deal with in relation to the urban environment and roads and traffic and so on. And this is another, I think, good example of a way of dealing with it. So firstly, a fence has been put up here. The tree has been pruned, and it has a huge cavity here. So it's a very important tree. It has lots of red data book species on it. And of course, felling would have been one option, but the least desirable option. So this tree now has a tether or a guy, a wire here, which is anchored it to the ground within this fenced area, because the worry was that it would fall onto the road, basically. So now with this in place, the idea is that if the tree begins to fall, it will fall away from the road, which has allowed this tree to survive and be kept and retained. And ultimately, that really is our main objective, even in urban areas, because actually wherever we have our veteran trees, they are important, and they've often been left behind as a part of kind of a historic wood pasture, but development has come, roads and housing estates have come, but we still, I hope, would want to do our best to retain as many as possible. And this is an example from Sweden, which was actually an elm avenue, and there was a lot of issues of conflict there with the road and the worry of branches falling down into the road. But it's also in a part of Sweden which is extremely valuable in terms of the species associated with old elms. And there's been a kind of a 10-year plan for this avenue, whereby you can see they've been created these monoliths, these standing structures. So instead of completely renewing and felling the whole avenue, the trees are being done in stages as and when Dutch elm disease starts to affect them, but to try and retain as much as possible of the standing dead tree. And sometimes actually these trees do produce new shoots. Now, it's not necessarily very pretty, but it does ensure that we retain the biodiversity value for as long as possible. And this is a way in which you can potentially make these retained dead wood elements more natural, because my experience, if I go back to the previous photograph, is that people often react to these straight, flat cuts, that they see this as an unnatural feature in the landscape, and particularly if it's been an avenue, which by its very nature is intended to be a feature in the landscape. But by doing some slightly more artistic cutting using a chainsaw, you can actually make it look much more natural. So retain the dead wood. And when we did this project on a site where I worked many years ago, when we cut these trees and branches with flat cuts, people reacted. Whereas when we did these slightly more artistic cuts, then they just didn't even notice that we'd done any work on those trees. It does take us a little bit more time, but it may be worth doing in those areas where there's high visibility and the aesthetics, the way the trees look, is very important, and to gain public support. So I'm just going to show a very short film which
Many veteran trees are found in urban areas. The principles of how to manage these trees are just the same as those in more rural locations, but the pressure on the trees may be caused by different factors. Veteran trees in these locations are even more likely to be valued for their aesthetic, heritage or social values. For people living in cities, trees are an important connection to nature, and studies have shown that they are important for human health. But these same trees can also be under enormous stress and are frequently physically damaged. Different countries may have their own legislation on the protection of veteran trees. This video shows some general principles about managing veteran trees in urban locations. Appropriate risk management of veteran trees is also very important, but is covered by a separate video. Trees in towns and cities are often growing in drought conditions because the water cannot soak through the hard, compacted surfaces around them. In addition, trees may only have effective roots on one side, as the other side is blocked by trenching for services like electricity or the foundations of buildings. The recommended root protection area for a veteran tree is 15 times the trunk diameter. This large RPA is important to reduce the possibility of damage or disturbance to the roots. Such a large RPA is sometimes hard to achieve in towns and cities, but at least aim for it. If the veteran tree has already lost part of the RPA to development in the past, protection of the rest of the root area is particularly important. If any work needs to be carried out around a veteran tree, long-term planning is crucial. Otherwise, trees might be lost in the process, like in this historical lime avenue. When work is actually taking place, the tree must be physically protected with strong fencing, ideally on the edge of the RPA, not like on these construction sites. The roots of veteran trees must also be protected from compaction, even from footfall. Compaction negatively affects the normal functioning of the soil and the roots. Even in urban locations, trees may still have important wildlife values, and it is important to check if there are protected species present before doing any work. In addition, the tree should be checked for any special local significance. If local people value the tree, they will help look after it. Even dead and dying veteran trees have great biodiversity value wherever they occur and should be retained. The canopies of veteran trees in towns and cities are often pruned for the wrong reasons, for example, to make it easier for contractors to work around it. Veteran trees should only be pruned by skilled arborists, and only if this is considered necessary for their long-term survival. Veteran trees in urban environments are frequently subject to a great deal of stress, which may not always be obvious. Management should aim to alleviate stress and not add to it. In this way, the best chance of long-term survival is reached, and the tree can continue to be appreciated by everyone.
So that was just a summary of the film we've produced as part of the VETcert project, which I'm talking about shortly, to help illustrate and summarise the issues in relation to veteran trees in urban areas. So just in the last part of my talk now, I want to talk a little bit about the creation of decaying wood and managing deadwood in urban environments and different ways that can be done, with some examples from Sweden and elsewhere. Information. I don't think we can talk enough to people about the importance of old trees and decaying wood, and I'm sure that's something that you're very experienced at doing. And this is an example actually from a Natura 2000 site in the Czech Republic, with a tree that had fallen over that they re-erected and used as a place to tell people about the history of the site and the values associated with old trees. And this is from a city in Sweden, where an old elm tree, which actually had the hermit beetle in it, that they retained, but also put a sign up to explain why a standing dead tree was retained. And again, this has stood there for more than 10 years. And I think that's a really good example of how we can actually retain deadwood even in the middle of our cities. Then you can make it into art. This is an example. This is actually a moss, Zygodon forsteri, which is found normally in water pools and roots, the buttress roots on beech trees. And it's a very rare species on this site and elsewhere. And the site here used a piece of deadwood to turn into art and to also illustrate something of the species that have been associated with the old trees. And I love this. And this is actually Jonas. These trees had to be felled as part of a development project, a road project. And Jonas arranged for the highways agency, to move these huge lumps of wood to a nature reserve where they could be re-erected. So they dug them into the ground and stood them up. And within 24 hours, he found red data book species investigating these particular pieces of wood. So whilst we'd prefer the trees to be standing, this was a really good way to make the best out of what was a far from ideal situation. They paid for these kind of small holes and areas and cavities to be created, which allowed Jonas to actually have a look and see what species were coming in. Then also some work has been done on what we call veteranization, which is creating habitats in young trees. Now, often this isn't something we're doing in urban environments, and it's a technique used to bridge the gap between old trees and young trees. And this is just a photograph of a woodpecker hole that was created with a chainsaw after 8 years, and this is a nuthatch that's using it for nesting. It's just a really fabulous example, I think, of ways in which we can create habitats that are otherwise only found in old trees, but in young trees. Now, these are not always suitable, as I said, in urban environments, but if there are trees that are not near to the path or trees that would otherwise have to be felled, it's potentially a technique that can be used. So creating woodpecker holes using a chainsaw is one. This is creating a cavity whereby a section of the trunk is removed. But this one I wouldn't recommend in urban areas, but I just wanted to show you a photograph of the different techniques we've been doing in Sweden and in England. Then another thing that's been done in Sweden with a lot of work and elsewhere are these wood mould boxes. So where you've got a few hollow trees, it's creating a box and then filling it full of the material that would be found otherwise in hollow old trees. And these are kind of multi-purpose boxes. They've got slits here which are suitable for bats, and they've got a hole on the other side which are suitable for birds, and then the material in the bottom is filled up with sawdust and leafy material and so on. So these are providing another gap or bridging another gap between the old trees and the next generation. And it's something that's being done both in urban areas and out in the wider countryside. But it's been very successful in urban areas and is a really good opportunity to put a sign up to explain why that this is, homes for the homeless is one of the signs that's been used to explain that, the lack of decaying wood habitat that we've got in our landscape. This is another technique that's been used. This is primarily for the stag beetle, but that we talk about decaying wood and the different sorts of decaying wood that are required, both standing, falling, in the ground, wet, dry, sunny, so on and so forth. And the picture shows on the right, these are the other type of wood mould boxes, so a smaller version. And this is, again, material that was actually partly from clearance work that had been done elsewhere, and they usually have a sign up to explain what this is all about. So finally, I just want to say that many of our very special veteran trees are in urban areas and are around people. This tree is from Romania and is in a zoo, and fortunately it's leaning towards a lake, but a fence has been put up. It has the ceramics, the beetle in it. It has benches nearby, and there's information about this tree that it's older than the zoo. And I think that's something that we must never forget, that many of these trees predate the urban environments in which they find themselves, and we can use that to our advantage to, if you like, sell the benefits of these fabulous old trees. So further information, there are several books that have been published, and these are actually available digitally. They're freely available online. They're both sadly in English, but the one on the right is also in several other languages, although I'm not sure how useful that is for you. It's in Spanish and Basque and in Flemish and in Swedish. And the book on the right has been published in Flemish and in Romanian. So that's all I have to say, and I'm very happy to take any questions. Thank you for listening.
Yes, I can hear you. Now I was instructed that you don't hear translation while you are in the direct conversation, so I will translate the questions to English and you will hear in English. The other people will get translation to Lithuanian.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
We got, actually, so far, we got one question for you.
Okay.
What kind of differences in people's attitude towards all trees and their conservation have you noticed in various countries in which you have worked?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I would say it's quite different and partly based on cultural differences. I'm most familiar with Sweden and the UK, and I think Sweden is a country of foresters working on plantations and cultivating trees. So trees are perhaps more of a kind of a resource, and therefore it's probably been harder to convince people of the value of individual trees or to think about trees as individuals. If I compare that with England in particular, where there's much fewer trees, much less forestry, so individual trees have a greater significance. However, the population is much greater and it's much more urbanized. So people are worried about safety, I think, much more so in the UK than they are in Sweden. And then I think in Spain and in the Netherlands, in Belgium, where I've also worked, again, the differences are very, very large there too. In Belgium, there are very few old trees, so each one is incredibly important and very valuable. And there's signs and there are boardwalks and there's lots of financial investment in looking after those trees. And then in Spain, they have a nationwide, what they call their giant trees or their momentous trees that they have, and those are protected. So it does vary very much, and a lot is related to cultural differences, that I would say, as to how people view old trees. But one of the things we all have in common, I think, is this historical connection. If you talk to people about the age of these trees, what they've seen over history and over time, most people can make that connection. I think I've found it much harder to convince people of the value for biodiversity, even if that's the area that I'm most passionate about and most interested about. You can talk about them being living blocks of flats and that kind of thing, but actually the history is often, and the story that you can tell, give the tree a name. That is a real significant issue in most countries for helping their protection.
Thank you for your reply. Actually, I have one question which was asked before, but I didn't ask it loud before. And I think that question could be, for me personally, it would be very interesting to hear your reply to that question. So Jurgita was asking, how to value, how to estimate an old tree growing in a city park when nearby grows a promising young trees?
What do you mean, which is more important, or?
I'm not really sure what the person asked, but maybe there is this situation when the young trees are overshading the old tree, but the young trees are promising too.
Yeah. Well, I always look at things from the point of view of what takes longest to recreate. So if you have a 400-year-old tree, we can't recreate it really without waiting 400 years. And therefore, I would always prioritize that, because if you have a younger tree nearby, which is shading, which may be 50 or 70 years, it's still much easier to replace that tree than it is to replace the one that's 400 years old. I think that's the way I always try to look at nature conservation with regard to old trees, as they are one of the features in our landscape across Europe and across the world, which are the hardest to recreate without waiting. I mean, we can go to the moon, we can even go to Mars, but we can't recreate a 300-year-old oak tree without waiting. So therefore, I would always prioritize the old tree. In addition, because of our lack of knowledge as to what that old tree houses, its wildlife and so on, we expect that older trees house a wider variety and range as well. So for those reasons, I would always prioritize the older tree, if that's the right answer to, I mean, if that's related to the question.
I hope if Jurgita hears us, maybe she could specify if she meant something else, but this is how I understood that question. And I think I have one more question, which I have to translate now on the spot. So what is the situation with the diseases of old trees, with the parasites in the cities? Is it a huge problem in various countries in which you have worked?
I would say there's a limited difference in between the cities and in the wider landscape. The big tree diseases that I've noticed have been ash dieback, Dutch elm disease, and then some of these diseases on things like horse chestnut, on beech, and also on oak. And I would say that if we take examples of the Phytophthora diseases, they may be more common in the urban environment because the trees are more stressed. And we could also say that about most tree diseases, that our older trees are generally more stressed in the urban environment and therefore more susceptible. But some of the other diseases like ash dieback, I think it's very difficult to see any pattern and any differences between urban and non-urban environments. It's perhaps more important to see the kind of genetic variety or the management around the areas. So in my experience, I've seen, as I said, the main factor being stress actually is what causes problems with our old trees in urban environments, and the diseases can take advantage of that.
Thank you for your reply. I don't see any more questions at the moment, so I just shortly say that we are waiting for your next presentation.
Vikki answered to all the questions that have been received, and her next presentation now will follow about specialists and their certification on at the European level, and the special certification system has been developed. And please write questions for this presentation. Don't be too humble. And questions usually are the most interesting part of the conference. They all will be translated and conveyed to Vikki. So, Vikki.
Good morning. My name is Vikki Bengtsson and I work for Natura. And today I'm going to talk to you about 2 European projects that we had about developing veterinary management skills and the certification scheme related to that. The 2 projects started with the first one, which was called VETcert, and that was about creating a pan-European training scheme to help improve skills and make that training material freely available. The project ran from 2014 to 2016, and the 3-day course was developed alongside a 1-day course, so a basic level and then a more advanced level. And the more advanced level was focused on training trainers so that we could roll out a training scheme across Europe, and that's translated into 6 languages, and as I said, is freely available, the 1-day course. But as a consequence of that project, people started to ask, can we have an accreditation scheme? So how do we prove to people that we have the skills that we require in order to prove to others, example, contractors and so on, that they can prove that they have the skills that they need in order to manage veteran trees? Ultimately, that's the objective. So just briefly on the VETcert project, the training material that's available is a 1-day course, but also a number of videos. And those videos have been incredibly useful for us because it allows people to train in their own time. And particularly with the current climate, that's an extra advantage. So there were 8 different videos produced, including things like how to clear around veteran trees, how to prune veteran trees, how to deal with old fruit trees, pollarding, issues of risk and safety. So many of those videos have been downloaded and watched across many countries, and they've been used in their own right for training, or as I said, for people to do their own kind of training at home. So the VETcert project started in December 2016, and as I said, it was building on the VETcert project, which was the training focused project. But this time we had 10 partners from 7 different countries, and these are all their logos here represented, from Spain, from France, from the Czech Republic, from Belgium, from the UK, Sweden obviously, and we also had the European Arboricultural Council as a partner with a view to helping the long-term sustainability of the certification scheme. And the project was funded, both projects were funded by Erasmus Plus although VETcert was funded by what we used to call the Leonardo da Vinci project. So, as I said, to begin with, the focus here was raising standards in veterinary care across Europe. And that's always been the focus with regards to both VETcert and VETcert, because these are such precious trees that they need the best possible care and the best possible people to take care of them. So the objectives of the VETcert project was to recognise skills and knowledge in veterinary management at two different levels. So the practising level for those actually climbing the trees and undertaking the work, and a consulting level for those advising. And the other objective really was to increase opportunities for tree work professionals across Europe so that people could go and work in different countries, which we know from previous experience is a fantastic way to develop our knowledge and experience and to learn from one another. But what did the project involve? Well, first of all, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel, so we did a survey of existing certification and accreditation schemes in all of the partner countries and outside. Then the other part was to actually decide what knowledge and skills would be required of a person who is working on veteran trees. Then we identified where there were gaps in the training material. So, for example, from VETcert, we had a whole range, as I've said, of training material available. But once we set the standards, it became clear that potentially there would be some gaps. And then the actual certification and examination procedure. And then finally, the most important part, I guess, once you've done a project like this, is ensuring it's sustainable in the long term. So to get the standard together, we first of all sent out a questionnaire to all of our contacts and their contacts across all the countries in Europe that we could, where we had that contact network. And the EAC obviously have an excellent network across Europe. We had almost 300 responses to that, which was really, really helpful. And this was asking, what are the biggest issues? What do you see as the areas that are most important in your country for managing veteran trees? And as a consequence of that, a draft of the standard was produced and issued to all partners, who then in turn talked to their key stakeholders regarding the content. And we had some excellent, really high quality feedback from that process. Then we locked ourselves in for a week in England, all of the partners, and went through all of that feedback. Now you can imagine it felt almost like a prison boot camp because there was so much to go through, so many different countries and cultures. And I think that's one of the things that I really, really enjoy about working on European projects, is that people have such different backgrounds, experiences and cultures that we learn from one another. But sometimes it can also be challenging to find compromise and to find a way that everyone is comfortable with. So the feedback was collated, we worked through the standard in detail, and we then sent it to be reviewed by Dr. David Lonsdale, who is a very experienced and knowledgeable arboriculturalist in the UK and researcher. So that was also very helpful, ensuring we didn't write something that either wasn't correct or that it was understood as well, because that's the key thing. It's very easy when you're all sitting in a room together to write a sentence, but when someone independently reads through it to make sure it makes sense was important. And they were finally produced in 2018 in April, and that felt like a huge milestone for the project because everything else that we were going to do after was based on those standards. So the two levels are available on the VETcert website. They were then translated into Spanish, Swedish, French, Czech and Dutch. Sadly, we don't have them in your language, but it's always possible to have them translated if you want to and if you have the money to do so. We'd be very happy if that were the case. And the two levels, so the practicing level and the consulting level, cover largely the same topics, but at a deeper level of knowledge for the consulting level. There are about 12 different units and at least 2 criteria within each of those units, and up to 25. And the biggest one is obviously the one that's the topic of actual management. So I just thought I'd go through very briefly the different headings and topics that we cover in the standards. So these are the knowledge requirements that people will have to achieve if they want to be a VETcert certified contractor or consultant. So the recognition and the values of veteran trees, how they develop and age, the role of physiological function and dysfunction, roots, of course, which is always one of the most important areas. Veteran trees as ecosystems, so their biodiversity value, then their value for people, but also for cultural history. Then also how to survey trees and tree sites, and not just individual trees. And that's the other thing about VETcert, is it's very broad, because if you're working with veteran trees, you have to understand that it's a broad area of expertise. Then obviously legislation and official guidance, and those have been modified for the relevant countries, because obviously every country has different legislation. Then the issue of risk management, planning and urban development, and then veteran tree management in all its aspects. And as I said, that is the largest of the units, as you would expect. And finally, personal skills. And this was one of the units that we discussed a lot, partly because many people in the project team felt that actually the biggest job we have to do as VETcert or as veteran tree managers is actually convince people of their value. And therefore having those skills where you can talk to people and you can share the knowledge and share the wonder and the imagination with regards to why these trees are so important. So that stayed with it. It came back and forth several times through the course of the project. So then the next step was, of course, to actually, how do we assess people? So it's one thing that we have a standard, but how do we actually make sure that people know or have this knowledge? So we worked very hard at an examination procedure and we tested one another. And I can say from my own experience that was a very traumatic experience, to stand there being examined by your peers, 10 people observing you and one person asking a question. And I was asked the first question, how would you describe a veteran tree, Vikki? And my brain just dried up. So I think it was a fantastic experience from the point of view of when we've gone on to be examiners, we understand how nerve-wracking it can be. But we examined one another in small groups, in large groups. We tested different types of examination procedure, and then we collated feedback both from the people observing, from the examiners, and from the candidates, if you like, our guinea pigs. And then we did some amendments and modifications, and we did another trial in March, a couple of months later. And then in May, we did an absolute full dress rehearsal in the UK, where we actually had candidates from different countries. And that was so useful. We had people from the Netherlands, we had someone from Italy, we had several different levels of people, so people that come at veteran tree management from the arboricultural route, but also people that come perhaps from the forestry side of things or the ecological side of things. And I'm an ecologist myself, so I come at this from a different aspect. And that was really helpful for us to understand which level we should pitch the appropriateness. So where people pass, the pass mark basically, how well people need to do in order to pass. So then after that, we did the final revisions, and then everything was translated. And as you can imagine, it's always a challenge with a European project when a product is finalized and translated and the people translating it suddenly read it in a lot more detail and identify potential issues. So that was also a relatively long process, but still a very useful one. It's an extra quality control actually in these European projects. So for the practicing level, candidates as the consulting level, they must have a number of prerequisites before they can apply. The exam is 1 day long, and it includes some multiple choice questions and a written paper where they have to have write some answers, some free text answers. And then there's some oral questions and outdoor exercises. So there's 2 key elements. We discussed long and hard whether or not we should have actually a climbing and cutting assessment as part of the exam for the practicing level. But for several reasons, including safety, including the fact that if we have a candidate who actually isn't up to the standard, do we really want them climbing our veteran trees and cutting them? Then also the fact of gaining permits and permissions, accessibility to actually find the right trees that actually need cutting it just would have made the exams impossible to run. So instead we do a simulation, and that has proven to be actually very, very useful and also possible to run. So the prerequisites are, we do not want people doing VETcert who are just newly qualified. Our understanding is that you get your arboriculture qualification, and then you need to climb trees. You need to work with trees to begin to understand the difference between managing and working on young and mature trees and managing and working on old trees. So we expect people to have 5 years experience. Now, they don't have to have 5 years experience of always working on veteran trees, because there aren't people doing that. This is still a relatively small component of the work that people do. But 5 years experience of working with trees, and also hopefully some experience of working with old trees in that time. And then we have different ways of coming in. So European tree worker is one, but given the variety and range of different types of qualifications across Europe, we have offered alternative options that people can prove they have equivalent certification or previous qualifications. So then consulting level, the same applies. They need to meet the prerequisites before applying, also 1 day long, but it's a tougher day. There are 3 elements to the exam. There's a written paper, then there's an oral session outside, and then there is a practical exercise there. And then in addition, they have to undertake a tree management plan, which has to be submitted as part of the exam. Again, prerequisites, we want people with experience, and that they need to have proved to the VETcert certification centre that they have adequate qualifications and certificates, and also suitable and relevant experience. So as I mentioned in the beginning, the standards as a process, we identified that there were a number of areas where there were gaps in the training material that we produced from VetTree. But not only that, we did a trawl from the new countries that were part of the VETcert project to see if there was other training material available. And we came up with a series of a wish list, if you like, a menu of the different types of training material we wanted to add to the range we already had, with the hope of helping support people get through VETcert. So we took the 3-day course from VetTree, and we have modified that and updated it into a 2-day course, whereby the trainer aspect has been removed, and we've added in some more advanced techniques. So that's now a 2-day course, which is more focused on the standard of VETcert. It doesn't do and give you everything you need. You will have to do other reading and do other sorts of training potentially to fill any gaps that you may have. But it does give a good framework, I think, for those interested in becoming VETcert certified. And we cover some of the topics like, sustainability, rooting, hollowing, fungi, and actually undertaking a survey and also producing a management plan. And it's in a very open environment, very interactive training course. Then we also have produced a number of fact sheets. So cabling, bracing and propping, our colleagues in the Czech Republic have a great deal of experience of this, and they helped produce a fact sheet because it varies hugely across Europe. Then diagnostic tools, for example, there are lots of tools on the market, but we want a VETcert certified consultant to be able to understand where the flaws are in these different tools with regard to veteran tree management, because they're not perfect, and that's important. Then valuation systems for trees, and also species associated. We've also produced a number of case studies, because I think the thing about managing veteran trees is there's not one size fits all. It's often a challenge to find the right management option, and there can be several. So we brought together a range of case studies from as many countries across Europe as we could, whereby a story is told and the pros and cons and the possible alternatives that were discussed, and then hopefully also what's happened and which choice was made. It's not always possible to have the results, of course, because these things take a long time, but it just gives people an idea of how things and how people are working with veteran trees in other countries. Then we produced an additional series of videos, and one of the areas that was a real gap was our understanding of fungi in trees. So we took on Professor Lynn Boddy from Cardiff University, who's done a huge amount of work with decay and trees since the 80s. And she's done a number of short films for us regarding the different relationships between trees and fungi, and also to try and kind of broaden our often oversimplistic view of how trees and fungi relate to one another. In addition, we have another 2 short films on kind of slightly more non-conventional techniques that may be used or tried with managing veteran trees, and then managing old pollards, and then finally the management of veteran trees in urban areas. Now I just want to show you a short amount of video from...
I'm Lynn Boddy, Professor of Mycology at Cardiff University, and I'm going to introduce you to fungi. Fungi are not plants, they're not animals, they're a kingdom of their own, a kingdom of around 5 million species. This vast kingdom is divided into several groupings, the most important of which from the point of view of trees and for wood decay are the ascomycetes and the basidiomycetes. The diversity of basidiomycetes is huge. There are mushrooms, brackets, crusts, clubs, puffballs, jellies. They come in all sorts of colours, sizes and shapes. There are a wide range of ascomycetes too. But what are fungi? The fruit bodies are just the tip of the iceberg. The main part of the fungus, the business part of the fungus, is hidden within whatever the fungus is growing on. It's called the mycelium. The mycelium is a network of fine filaments called hyphae. They're microscopic, about 15 micrometers in diameter, so we can't see them with the naked eye. But en masse, they are visible. So you can see them here on this Petri dish of agar jelly. Sometimes hyphae aggregate together to form structures that look superficially a bit like roots. These include the rhizomorphs of honey fungus and mycelial cords, seen here growing from colonised wood across the surface of soil in search of more wood. However, most saprotrophs are restricted to whatever it is they're growing in. Fungi mostly arrive at new resources as spores. These are produced in the fruit bodies and many millions are released. Most of them are deposited within a few meters of the fruit bodies, but occasionally they spread very much further, sometimes hundreds of kilometers. If conditions are suitable, spores will germinate and hyphae will emerge. Initially, hyphae branch in a haphazard way. Soon a more organised pattern emerges, and hyphae no longer overlap and compete with each other. In fact, hyphae diverge, and as the colony expands, side branches form and grow up rapidly to fill the gaps at the margin, so nutrient absorption is optimised. Fungi are not plants, they don't contain chlorophyll, so they can't fix carbon. They have to use dead organic matter. They do this by secreting enzymes which break down big molecules into small ones, and then they absorb those small molecules and use them for growth. All naturally produced organic molecules can be used by fungi as a whole, though different species have different abilities. They obtain their nutrition in different ways. Saprotrophs use dead organic matter. Necrotrophs kill, though there are very few killers of trees. Biotrophs, on the other hand, obtain their nutrition from living tissues. So you might think straight away, well, these must be parasites and doing harm to whatever it is they're growing on. And yes, some are. But others are mutualists and are essential for trees. These are the mycorrhizal fungi. So to sum up, mycelium is the key to the fungal lifestyle, and fungi are key to healthy trees and healthy ecosystems.
So as you can see, that's just an example of one of the films that we've produced. There is another one which specifically about mycorrhizae, which Lynn mentioned there, but also on heartwood and heartwood in oak, for example, heartwood decay. And these are areas that are really, really crucial to understand if you're managing veteran trees. So just a final few slides. The certification scheme is now available. Sadly, we have had some delays to the examinations that we've put in place because of COVID, I'm sure that you're familiar with. But just 2 weeks ago, we had our first in Sweden, and that was great, at both levels. And in Belgium, there were some certification exams last week. And in the UK, they're planning for the spring as well. So things are happening, although it's been a bit delayed. We were afraid that we were going to lose the momentum, but it feels now like things are happening, because actually, given that an awful lot of this is done outside, it's still possible to do it keeping social distancing measures in place. And for an exam, you want to have people far apart from one another. So it actually works quite well. So the EAC are responsible across Europe for the actual rollout of the scheme. So they're the ones that are administrating in it on behalf of the VETcert project. And they are the ones issuing the cards and the certificates and keeping records of the people who are certified. So this is kind of how it works, kind of a schematic picture of how it works. So we have what we call the managing body, which is the European Arboricultural Council, and they felt like the natural choice, given they have European tree worker and tree technician and have contacts in more than 20 countries in Europe. Then they have contact with what we call the VETcert Certification Centre, and then they run the assessments. They may also have training, or that may be run by a different organisation. And then we also have a steering group. So that is made up of the original partners from the VETcert project, and they are involved in ensuring quality and also reviewing the standards. They will deal with any issues that arise with regards to, for example, new VETcert certification centres. If, for example, you wanted to develop a VETcert certification centre, then that's via the steering group that process would take place. And the candidates contact a VECC or VETcert Certification Centre to sit an exam, and that's all available on the EAC and the VETcert website, those ones that are up and running. And these are the organisations that are currently VETcert Certification Centres. So we have Sveriges Arboristförbund in Sweden, we have the Asociación Española de Arboricultura in Spain, Arboristica Academy in the Czech Republic, Arboricultural Association in the UK, and InVerde in Belgium. Now, one of the advantages that we saw with this constellation of partners is that we all have several languages, which allows us actually to certify people in more countries than just our own. For example, InVerde, they can also work with the Netherlands, and they also speak French. So they are able to run certification schemes in France and in the Netherlands and in Belgium. And for us in Sweden, obviously we speak English, but we also can work with Norway and Denmark and also Finland, actually, to some extent. So just to give you an example, we try to have partners and certification centres which can run courses or run certification exams in different countries than just their own. So from the candidate's point of view, their contact is with the VETcert Certification Centre, and then they register themselves, they pay their fee, they may undertake some training, and then they go through the examination. And then the feedback, whether they passed or failed, goes back to the EAC, and then they issue the certificate and the cards and keep the register online. Because that's something else that was important, was that if you're an organisation, want to employ a contractor, you're able to go into that website and see if a particular company or person is qualified. So the benefits. Why should an organisation employ a VETcert professional? Well, we hope that this means that you will have a much better chance of good quality work being carried out. And it's possible to set this as a requirement during the tendering process, which also makes it much easier to separate out those individuals who may talk the talk, but when it comes to it actually can't undertake the work or don't have the experience. It allows easier competitiveness to be able to measure people against one another, and it also allows organisations to measure value and cost in a different way. And equally, for those contractors, it allows them to prove that they actually do have these skills and knowledge. That's not been possible before. So those contractors and consultants who've actually been very skilled and spent a lot of time training and developing themselves, very knowledgeable and skilled, have not been able to prove to a client that they actually have these skills and knowledge. So that's all I wanted to tell you about the project. And obviously we hope that this is something that's going to be rolled out in more countries across Europe in order to, in the long term, improve the care and management of our very, very special trees. So that just leaves questions if you have any. And for me to say thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Vikki. We have at the moment 4 questions. And since we are a bit running out of time, I might not take all the questions which appear later, but these 4 we already have. I think the first question would be to your first presentation actually. What is the situation with ashes? If the roots are heavily damaged, is it safe to have such trees in an urban environment?
Well, it depends on how badly damaged they are and where they are. I think you would have to do an individual assessment of those trees. That's not something that I could make a statement about. If the roots are badly damaged, then the tree can't stay there if it's likely to fall over, of course. So we would treat those in the same way as any other tree in the urban environment. If there's a high risk, then we would have to undertake some kind of management.
Thank you for your reply. Then I have 2 questions which are very similar to each other in my understanding, so I just read them both together. Isn't Sweden and other countries required that the tree management works would be implemented by certified specialists, or can they be implemented by any local workers? And the second, who is managing green spaces in the cities? What kind of qualification requirements are raised for these people? Are these requirements in the legal regulations?
Okay. The first question was, well, if I take the second question first, people managing green spaces in urban environments varies. It's often the municipalities and their employees that are managing those. And I would say no, they don't have to have necessarily any particular qualifications. And I think that's been a real concern for us in Sweden with people managing old trees. Many people are very, very skilled, but they may not have been through formal qualification process. Can you repeat the first question, please? Sorry.
Isn't Sweden and other countries required that the tree management works would be implemented by certified specialists, or can they be implemented by any local workers?
And that varies hugely across Europe. In the UK, for example, there is an approved contractor scheme, as we call it, whereby companies go through a certification process to ensure that they have standards and quality. But it's by no means the case that all work is carried out by those professionals. It's up to the people buying the services to specify that in their tenders or in the work that they're asking to be done. So we have many people in the UK that undertake tree work that don't have any formal qualifications. Legally, they should do from a safety point of view, but it's a one-man band, then it's much more difficult. In Sweden, there is currently no qualifications formally recognised or legally recognised. And it's only relatively recent that arboriculture has been actually taught in Sweden. Most of the arborists who are working in Sweden have gone to other countries to educate themselves. And it's the same there. Unless the organisations specify it in their tenders, then potentially people who have no, qualifications, if you like, can be the ones employed to do the work, particularly if it goes against price. And that's one of the reasons why VETcert has come, because we saw that as a major issue. But we also see that VETcert builds on existing qualifications. So we want people who have got proper qualifications and who have studied, or people who've perhaps worked a long time and therefore can prove that they have those skills and knowledge even if they haven't gone through a formal education process. Then in Belgium, there's nothing at all like that. In Spain, they're working on it, but it's very variable.
I see. We, as Lithuanian Fund for Nature, we are organizing tenders at the moment for veteran tree management, which are inhabited by Osmoderma. And in our tenders, we are requiring arborists to have certification, either European Arboristic Council or International Society of Arborism or VETcert, because we have one arborist in Lithuania who already has VETcert. And we work with some municipalities actually, and they are also looking that maybe it's a positive example to require certification, because then you get skilled people and you can trust that the work they do is good for the tree.
Absolutely. Just to add to that, that's what we're doing in Sweden as well, that the municipalities and the national agencies are specifying VETcert as a recommendation for, or as an advantage, if you like, for those tendering. And I think that's really where, you know, this chicken and egg, we need people to take the qualifications, but we need people to specify it in the tenders. And I just hope that we can get some more momentum after COVID, where more people can be qualified, so that it makes it more open and transparent, because obviously with only one person with that qualification, it's quite difficult. But only just 2 weeks ago in Sweden, we've quadrupled the number of people that have got VETcert in Sweden. So I'm optimistic.
And then it's also quite a relative question to our discussion. Please share your experience. How are arborists, after graduating the course you organize and getting certified, how they are integrated in the labor market?
That also varies, but as part of the project, we had workshops with organizations like yourselves, like, you know, the WWF, or like the National Agency for Nature Conservation, the government agencies, the municipalities, whereby we talk to them about what they might want to see in VETcert, what type of qualifications they would want to see and knowledge they would want to see, and how we could help them in the project include those in future tendering processes. And I think that's been successful. In Sweden, we've had 3 tenders that have come out recently where they've specified it as an advantage for those putting in the prices. And so that's, I guess, the way that we manage that process, is to keep those both sides, if you like, those who would take VETcert and those who specify VETcert for work in the future, to make sure that both pieces are there. Otherwise, the one won't work without the other. So that's how we see it being integrated. And also we hope that by having a European-wide qualification, I mean, you talked about ISA's arborist, you talked about EAC's arborist, European tree worker, and so on. There's relatively little about nature conservation and nature conservation values in both of those qualifications, which is why we saw VETcert being very, very important for those of us working on the most special trees and the most valuable trees. So it's about sharing that experience and knowledge, and obviously talking to you now, hopefully we can share, you know, VETcert even more widely and integrate even more arborists into this area of work. Even if it's not a huge amount of work for an individual company, it's still the work that an awful lot of arborists love doing.
Thank you for your reply. I have such more technical question. What kind of tools do you recommend for evaluation of a tree condition?
That's a technical question. I think with regard to, it was a topic we discussed a lot in the development of VETcert, on the basis that tools are very good, but it's often the interpretation of the tools that's the problem with regard to old trees. So, for example, if we use the tomograph needs to be interpreted by someone with skills and understanding that identification of hollows in a trunk is just one part of the story. So people have used all sorts of different tools and all across Europe in different countries to assess trees: tomograph, resistographs, a hammer. And actually, out of all the countries and all the people we discussed, the hammer was the one that was the most popular because it was the cheapest and you can always have it in your pocket. And there's a lot of discussion we expect of the VETcert professionals to understand the limitations of the different tools and techniques that are available with regards to veteran trees. For example, that yes, a tomograph identifies a hollow perhaps, but you need to understand what implication that has on a veteran tree. It may have a reduced crown. It has a large trunk diameter, which reduces the likelihood of failure anyway. So it's just, I guess, I'm not answering your question directly, but I think there are lots of tools that are out there, but it's important to understand their limitations with regards to veteran trees. And I think in summary, most people that we have spoken to and had feedback from prefer a hammer, even if there's lots of technology out there.
I would agree that it's more a person who has the tools matters more than the tools themselves.
Indeed, absolutely.
And I check if I received any questions in my device.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody is asking about specialists in Lithuania, so I cannot ask this question to you. We will leave this for discussion. And then the questions for you are over. Thank you very much for your replies.
Thank you very much. I hope I get the opportunity to come and visit you and see your lovely trees.
We are looking forward for you to come.
Thank you.
See you later.
Bye-bye.
Tai Vikki atsakė visus klausimus ir
He answered all questions, and now my colleague Alvydas Gintaras will present his presentation, including guidelines that Lithuanian Nature Fund developed for the management of the trees veterans in order to preserve and to create habitats. And we would like people who manage city forests, in particular municipal employees, to provide their feedback, what they think about our guidelines. Maybe they have comments of how these guidelines could be changed, modified. So stay with us and please participate in the discussion. And now Alvydas Gintaras and his presentation. So I represent Lithuanian Nature Fund. I'm very happy that we had so many interesting presentations today, and I will attempt to present information about guidelines, how to manage giant trees and veteran trees in cities, in the urban environment. The content, the purpose of the guidelines is important forest elements for the preservation of biodiversity, recommendations for the evaluation, recommendations and communication strategies with the society. The purpose to create conditions for the protection and preservation of biological diversity. This idea was related with Kaunas Ąžuolynas and Neries Valley atverkiai, but in principle, these guidelines can be applied for cities, for visited areas, and key task is to provide recommendations for the evaluation of the condition of the trees and the identification of the possibilities to preserve them, also recommendations for the management of the deadwood, also threats for human safety in highly visited places, to provide recommendations, standard solutions for the removal of threats, and provide a communication strategy in order to explain the importance of the deadwood in the forest. So elements which are important for the biological diversity. Forests or their shortage, I would say, is a
gali būti nuo kviečių lauko iki natūralaus miško, tačiau to natūralaus yra gerokai mažiau už kviečius. Galime taipogi tarpiniai variantai, tai yra svetimžemių medžių plantacijos, vienarūšiai arba mišrūs medynai ir toliau miškai, kuriuose yra daugiau arba mažiau ūkininkavimo. Priklausomai nuo to ir įtaka biologiniai įvairoviai tokių miškų irgi yra skirtinga. Tai per amžius miškuose buvo senų ir žuvusių medžių, tai buvo norma, kurie tie medžiai arba seni arba žuvę buvo daugelio specializuotų organizmų buveinė. Ir
habitats for different species, and later on part of the species disappeared or became exceptionally rare. And the current use of forests is in the opposition of the natural processes, and therefore forests are logged when growing slows down, when technical maturity is reached, but there are many, many more years, hundreds of years left until that real maturity, and trees which would exceed that maturity, trees veterans, or trees which are dead already, but they are still standing, there are even less of them. And the situation in Lithuania is such that the same most valuable, oldest forests are often, very often, within cities like Kaunas or Vingis Park, or near the cities, where due to different harming effects, those trees started aging earlier than usually and becoming trees veterans and giants much earlier than naturally. But nevertheless, diversity is really great. And those rare species included in the Lithuanian Red Book are related, associated with giant trees and deadwood. And I speak here of trees which are around associated with around 100 birds and insects, fungi and plants, also deadwood and the forest environment are important conditions, of course, on which have a great influence. Your colleagues attempted to calculate of how in proportion organism groups depend on deadwood. That's not strange at all that these are fungi most of all, because wood is that substrate which is divided by fungi. And now about recommendations for the evaluation of the condition of trees and possibilities to preserve them. And this is an example in Kaunas Aukeri, where we worked. A similar tree is in this picture, similar to the tree that we managed. And now giant trees and the trees veterans, they have some typical elements in common. Cavities in the branches, dead wood inside the trunk, dry branches, fallen parts of the tree, cavities, holes of burrs, crevices in the trunk, on the bark, also water accumulation in certain places, moss and lichen on the trunk. If we find at least 4 elements, that means that biologically the tree is very valuable and who has exceeded natural maturity and shifting to the aging phase or stage, early or late, depending on the elements, or rather on their quality and stages of the growth of the tree, from the seed to the later stages. And if we speak about natural maturity, early aging or late aging until the perishment of the tree, so very few trees manage to achieve that stage. In particular, in areas where farming is practiced in the forests. Trees reaching natural maturity. For some, that causes problems. In particular, that is important when we talk about reserves, because part of the society think that sick tree, no tree is a problem, and that is a feature of the neglection. This is a bad habit, but it appeared because we are used to seeing young trees, 60 years in average, although in the past those trees can live for 300, even more years. So that approach, that attitude creates a wrong image. Evaluation of the condition of giant trees, it should be done based on two aspects and according to importance for biological diversity and with respect to the human safety. For biological diversity, we can carry out detailed research of flora and fauna, which is most costly, also doing descriptions of giant trees, or while identifying the most important elements, which is quite cheap and easy to do, and this is how you can describe many trees. Also, threat for human safety, it should be identified based on the physiological condition of the tree, whether it is strong, it can resist winds, etc. Also, the condition of the roots and also the venue of the tree close to the paths. Of course, much bigger requirements for physiological condition should apply, and also fragmentation of the location and the situation of trees in them, whether trees are close to the alleys and paths and also depending on the surrounding neighboring trees. Now, recommendations for the leaving of the dead wood based on the NEPCON temporary standard, which is in force from 2014. This wood should be left in different stages of rotten. These are dry trees, dead standing woods, fallen trees, and must be left in the natural condition. Take into account roads, paths, recreation venues, and the risk of accumulation of pests. And the general quantity of that wood should make at least 5% of the log liquidated volume. So this applies to logging when logging works are carried out, but around forests, we have also recreation areas and other types of areas. So how much of that dead wood should be left in those cases? First of all, that dead wood is the richest habitat in a healthy forest, and all trees together with fallen trees and dead standing trees is the key habitat of the forest on which 1/3 of species in the forest depend. And one should not cut the remnants into pieces. Cutting into pieces is no good. And the trees should be left as they were. Branches should not be piled on top, and no heaps should be created. And also, we should avoid, disappearance of that wood. So let's be natural. Let's leave that wood as it is. Let's not access other sanitary at the time of the sanitary actions and other loggings, and let's not do benches of the dead wood because the bark is peeled off, it is then rubbed, etc. So this is not the same as that that would be left as it is naturally. Leaving of the dead wood and discussions around that. We have developed a certain matrix for that purpose, which is as if a compromise between aesthetics, biological diversity, its protection, and public information. Leaving of branches is not the subject of these guidelines because each territory has its own desires and wishes, and some want to leave more area for mowing, others for human visiting, and so then influences will be less if I talk about big diameter wood, which is a priority, and how much of it should be left, at least 10-15 cubic meters per hectare. And it would be best that it is left alongside with the activities of informing the society, so that the society gets accustomed and used to this practice and knows why this is done. What type of wood, when, and how? Of course, dry trees should not be left at the paths, at the roads, because of the risk of the branches. But if they are of impressive size and cause no danger, are fenced, or people don't walk over there, but they can see them, then there is meaning in leaving them, and in other places in order that 10-15 quantity of cubic meters per hectare is achieved. And then dead standing trees, it would be good that if impressive trees are left without causing any dangers of impressive size, and the same applies to visiting places, and in other places they could be left in order in order to achieve that volume. With fallen trees, things are more simple because they usually do not cause any danger because they lie down on the ground, and maybe bigger diameter fallen trees should be left at the paths without branches in order mowing is possible, or people could move around. The same applies to visiting places that they are left in order to achieve that determined established minimal volume. Communication strategy. Urban forests, they're the best place for the education of the society because they are closest to them, close to human flows. And that message that we want to convey is easiest to convey, namely here. And we can divide all that into passive and active measures. Events, for example, would be active measures, and passive measures would be different information boards. And all that has some meaning. And, information boards, they do their job, and people come up and can read if they're interested. And in particular, if people have some negative emotions, they read, they know, and then they can understand the reasons of leaving that particular tree. And stands also could be different, like large ones, and less of them at the entrances. And they could talk a story of the meaning of the Deadwood and giant trees, and why park managers care about biological diversity, how, what, and where is left, and also about dangers, potential dangers to visitors. For example, in Germany, if visitors walk somewhere farther from the path and the wind is more than 15 meters per second, then this is a personal responsibility of the visitor, to take care of himself or herself. And people are warned and they have to follow some rules. We do not have such practice in Lithuania, but we could make first steps in this direction so that visitors are warned. They are educated that in the windy weather, one shouldn't go too deep into the forest because there may be dangers, and it's not possible to cut all the branches, and you cannot make the forest entirely sterile. And smaller notices, boards could be attached to some specific trees and other objects, and which could talk about the giant trees of the importance, historical importance for nature, and the fallen trees of the large diameter, in order to show that they were intentionally left, and this is not any negligence, etc. And also informing about their value for forests. In the previous slides, you saw, Previously, you heard about, practices of public awareness raising in Scandinavian countries, but little by little, we also start copying the best practice of foreign countries. And in Kaunas Aukery, on the dry Deadwood, we attach tables and some notices that the society sees, understands, and perceives, the importance and the purposes of leaving that wood. So we did that in 2 areas, in Kaunas Aukery and Neries River Valley at Verkiai. And we received many comments, different comments. Some say that was good. Others say that we, give rise to pests. And some were broken, but then we returned them back and they still are there. So we think our measures justify themselves and people will start accepting that information about Deadwood better and better with time, in particular in rural areas and forests that are more often visited. That's all from me. In short, thank you for listening to me. And now I would like to get over to our discussion part and at least briefly provide answers to certain questions concerning these guidelines. Where should they apply? In which forests? Parks, forests of protected areas or unprotected, non-protected, but having big nature value, or in main habitats, or just in forests important for recreation, or maybe in all municipal forests, or maybe only in live project areas only. Other questions, what types of forests should be subject to those guidelines? And which types most conflicts arise? What do you think? And should those guidelines be differentiated by by types of rural forests? And is that list enumerated here is sufficient or not? So these are my key questions for this discussion. Thank you. Alvydas invited us for a discussion, and I have the previous question asked by Auksė for Vikki. But this question is not for Vikki. She asked how many specialists do we have, and should they work in botanical gardens or not? I'll try to answer to this question about certification. Talked about by Vikki VETcert. This is a new thing, and not yet applied in all European countries. In Lithuania, we have only one specialist, but we are very happy that we have him. But there are other arboristic certification schemes which apply not so much to biological diversity, but in general to assess the professionalism of arboristic specialists, and the European tree worker certificate and the higher qualification issued by the same European Arboristical Council, EAC, European Tree Technician certificate of 2 types, and there is a global certification more characteristic of the United States of America, which is called ISA. We do not have many TV specialists in Lithuania, and we as a Lithuanian Nature Fund have a task set for us that we should have as many arborists with such certificates as possible. Therefore, we organize tenders, and in them we indicate, the priority and advantage of being certified. And with years, we see more and more people sit exams, and the TV, I cannot tell you now precisely, is changing. Perhaps there are 5. When we started the project, there was only 1 person, so it's quite an increase, I would say. ISA is one, for sure. maybe more, but I cannot tell you. And VETcert is one. So these were general questions, and now I invite you for the discussion. I see Alvydas on the screen. I would like to see Žydrūnas as well. Here we are, all Lithuanian speakers are with us. And when Alvydas indicated all those questions, to which I would like to receive your comments, whether those guidelines could be applied to different types of forests in Lithuania, both for natural protected areas, and would it be meaningful to have them for forests of the recreational purpose? So there is a box for questions. Please write. I would like to see all of them. But I am not receiving new questions. And Žydrūnas perhaps also saw the presentation of those guidelines for the first time. I still don't know. Okay. Questions from participants. One. I will read. How many municipal workers were introduced to the importance of the deadwood for biological diversity and how to improve situation? How many of them know about that importance? Do we have any opinion about that? Actually, we asked whether municipal employees are introduced to that knowledge, but we don't know because we don't work at the municipalities. But maybe you, Žydrūnas, you work with diverse people. Maybe you have some subjective opinion about their skills and knowledge and level of that knowledge. Deadwood, and in particular, dry trees, there's the prevailing opinion shouldn't be in the cities, in the urban areas, because they cause dangers for people, for their security. That is a prevailing opinion, which should be changed. We should talk about urban parks and forests, other places, including pedestrian parks. So I think that people are mistaken, and we would need some courses or training for specialists working at the municipalities and who are responsible for the green zones of the cities, so that they know that it's better to leave a tree, a fallen tree or a dry tree, with information attached to it and explaining the importance. And sometimes we artificially, create conditions for woodpeckers, etc. But we destroy trees, so it's a bit of conflict. Yes, I agree. How could we address such situations so that people working at municipalities have more knowledge about biological diversity in the old trees, the giant trees? We try to improve the situation. We were inviting, municipal employees to listen to our presentations, and I hope there are some municipal workers who are listening to us and who, in the course of today, received valuable knowledge and will be applying that knowledge in their work. And I received more questions. For example, I think that guidelines would be good for city parks, which have exceptional value, objects of cultural and natural or nature heritage. Maybe for those objects which have exceptional value and possess certain statuses of culture or history. I think this is an individual opinion. People understand things differently. Naturalists would like to preserve everything, and people of culture, again, would like to care about their own interests. Municipal workers have their own opinions. There are many different opinions, and we still have to preserve as much of that biological diversity as possible. Although opinions are very diverse, but my opinion is preservation of that biological diversity. because we have to bear in mind reality. And I would also like to add or to supplement the question to the previous question concerning the deadwood and knowledge. Deadwood should be differentiated of what it consists of, because dead oak, its value and, for example, value and threat, it differs from the ash tree, because we hear some reports about trees falling on the trees and also falling on the mother and on the child. There were 2 cases and they have a negative impact. So I wanted to find out more knowledge and more information. So maybe we should differentiate trees and not to allow ash trees grow in such sensitive places. And yes, we should take care of that and to plan in advance. And if an oak grows, but things are much more simple with oaks and lime trees. And safety is also different in terms of different trees. Okay, thank you for your opinion. I would like to add, if possible, to what I said before. Cultural and natural heritage is created by us. We establish how things are going to be later. If we have a heritage of nature park with lime trees 100 years old, and if we think that this park can cause some dangers to people and fall down on people, then we will never have lime trees of 600 years. Whereas there would be great, huge value for many generations after us. For example, what we have like in Kaunas, in parks within rural areas, trees of several hundreds years of age, they have been protected, preserved by many generations for us. So if we want, and we hear from more than one municipality, let's log the park, let's make it fresh, let's remove all trees and let's replant it with fresh young trees of 10 years old, etc., which is wrong in my opinion. So in fact, we prevent, future valuable parks. We interfere and we're afraid of the accumulation of old trees, which is a very wrong attitude. Because very, very old, but nevertheless, it's strange because we kind of sanctify the very, very old trees, but we have to think that they do not come from nowhere. I agree with you. If we take care now of them, and if we take care only of the monuments of nature, they will all disappear because old ones disappear and nobody takes care of the potential monuments of nature. But actually, we inherited those real monuments of nature from our ancestors. But we also have to do something for the future generations. I look at other questions. I try to sort them out. Some of we have just statements. For example, municipal employees do not know very well concepts of the deadwood, but that depends on their attitudes. They had the possibility to know that concept better. And Martina asks, are you arranging or organizing official recommendations for municipalities, in particular in rural areas? Maybe something more than a conference. Yes, these guidelines presented by my colleague Alvydas can be found in our internet website, Osmoderma _LT. And if you have some questions, please ask. We can discuss, improve the guidelines and recommendations. And then those recommendations will be perhaps better and you will be able to use them. And people can copy those guidelines. We do not apply any author's rights, no problems at all. Administrations, municipalities, they can use them, copy, And of course, they have to know legal aspects, but we are very open. We just offer you take the guidelines and use or apply them or change or amend or modify. We want a compromise between safety and biological diversity. We want to retain that compromise and we want to preserve values for future generations. And we have offered to Kaunas municipality to apply these guidelines in Kaunas, Aukeri, and also on Verkei territory, Neris, the Neris River Valley. And we offer them use those guidelines. We cannot comment on their actions, not yet. It's too early, but we kindly invite them to ask questions. We will be pleased to consult them, to advise, including park managers who could apply, who could use those guidelines for their purposes. Thank you. Next, Jurgita offers to preserve deadwood and biological diversity just in rural areas. And park management very often becomes a political tool. Do you agree? Do you have any comments on that? About politicians and their manipulations on the question of tree management. I don't think that political winds should be blowing to this direction. We shouldn't politicize these topics and to preserve what we need to preserve and where we need to preserve it. I would think that the same creation of the parks, the principle should be different. Urban forest is something else different than city parks. I imagine, an urban dweller. So I can't imagine a city park and a forest of lime trees of 30 years old. So it's much more pleasant, of course, to walk in the forest of the lime trees or maple trees, which are much older, 100 years. So I'm sure of that. It's always going to be pleasant to walk in that old stand of forest by the old trees. Unless, of course, there are parks, including with different infrastructure for recreation and for children. Yes, this is another thing. But if we talk about parks for walking, for sports, etc., for running, elder trees are much better, and the concept of the parks should change. But that depends on every particular conditions and situations, because sometimes we need to carry out works of formation and to wait. It's a long process. So this is a matter of the strategy of the city municipalities, where to form, where they have more people, where people like to walk, where there are recreation zones open or filled with trees and by age, etc. Elder people like one thing, younger people like another thing, the people perhaps like to sit in the shade of the tree, etc. There are differences, and attitudes should differ, and strategies should be different too. A very good question by Martina. Are you going to provide recommendations for the Ministry of the Environment to change the regulatory base? Because, according to them, fallen trees or trunks of dry trees are not protected. Should they have a status of protection or not? I would think yes, why not? They could be included, but we have to decide and to define rules for the diameters. If the diameter 10 centimeters of the fir tree, perhaps it's of little value. But if a big tree got dry, we have to see at the venue. And there are commissions of plants at the municipalities, and they have to decide to see, to assess, and to decide whether the tree is dangerous or not. But big, large, dried trees should be included, of course, in the regulatory base, in the rules. And I would add that there are two sides of the coin. Does the central government or should the central government take care of each dry tree or not? I think not, if municipalities perform their functions properly. And these questions wouldn't even arise, but there's another thing. If municipalities are not effective, shouldn't then the central government urge that municipal government to be more active and to improve? So you never know who is first, the egg or the hen. Maybe, yes, the ministry could indicate certain indices, some units, quantities, areas, because the situation with live trees is quite poor, and nothing to speak of the situation with dead trees. And I would add that clarification to the municipal workers should be provided about the importance of Deadwood. And when people start understanding the importance of these fallen trees, standing trees, dry trees, in particular in terms of other species, so their protection evolves through that understanding. Okay, what else do we have? Another person asks, what could you offer for the maintenance of small areas of parks in urbanized areas in order to preserve veteran trees and dead wood? What could you offer? This is the matter of planning. The planning process is very important, most important, I would say. If we have some valuable trees, green or dry, it doesn't matter, the planning process should be very important. And no parking lots or some construction should be planned close to them. They should be, so to say, planned at a certain distance, which should be set in the documents. So planning is everything. And I would like that all infrastructure that is being developed should not be directed, in such a way that physiological functions are destroyed, the root system is destroyed, and that depends on who is the owner of that area, urbanized area, maybe some owner of the MENA or maybe local municipalities. And yes, anyway, professional arboristical management should be exercised and not some workers who have no idea of how to manage such old trees. So we should have specialists who are devoted and who can carry responsibility for the works carried out by them. And I would also add that the most important thing, perhaps, when we speak about plants, to have a long-term strategy. And more than 10, 20 years. We have to think 50 years ahead because, it's still too often when plants are planted, then some rows are constructed or poles constructed, trees become an obstacle, and then they are pruned, etc., and then things become really a real catastrophe. We all know that trees grow long and slow, and it's not possible to plant, remove, and then to replant. No, we have to think 50 years, even more ahead, 100 years at least, in order to plant spaces properly, green spaces or alleys of trees. In terms of this question, how to preserve ancient trees or dead wood in small parks within towns and cities, In cases when municipalities decide to renew those parks, the mechanism can be very complicated, but searching for protected species and analyzing and knowing if they inhabit, some deadwood like lichens, mosses, or insects. And so this could be a good road to consider when we want to protect cities, even in smaller towns or cities, even if the municipality doesn't plan to do that. Of course, if local people find such values, yeah, that would be great, and that would inspire them, and they could set examples for others. Even if people are not specialists, they may not recognize species and their frequency, but if the habitat is in place, the most important thing is to preserve that habitat, that it survives, accompanied by big probability of the species inhabiting that habitat. And it doesn't mean that if I found no any rare species, this tree is not valuable. No way. It is valuable for something. Same fungi. They do not grow each year. Maybe, the bodies of the mushrooms, cannot be seen, now, but they will be seen tomorrow. The most important thing is preservation of their habitats and species. They themselves will take care of their survival. I also recalled one event which happened quite recently. In one place, people wanted to log a very, very old spruce tree in the cemetery. A new head of the municipality came, and he was not very well aware of the situation, but somebody complained, and he hired some, loggers, and the person sees that, that old spruce tree is going to be logged. But the spruce tree is incredibly old, inhabiting different, invertebrates and different species. And those people who live close to that cemetery, so that man remembered that he paid 10 liters so that in Smetona times, in old times, that spruce tree is not logged. And a new, head of the municipality came without knowing the situation and decided to help. And somehow, those people who lived nearby managed to drive away those loggers and to persuade the head of the municipality about the importance and value of the tree. So even if there are no legal ways, one has to talk to the municipality and to explain about the necessity to preserve trees, all trees which are incredibly important for people living nearby. Next question by Jurgita. Who would develop greener's drafts, and who would identify stability and safety of the deadwood? Who should set that, establish and identify? There are specialists of the green plots of land, and there are commissions, and I would just say that biologists should be included, at least one, in the work of the commission who work with diversities, and they should provide recommendations concerning one or another decision. But biologists, they are not designers. They can just assess trees and their value for nature and to say whether they could be left or could be logged. So they should provide recommendations. So experts are necessary, at least one included in the municipal commissions if we speak about long-term planning. And that would be a teamwork. And assessors, who could be assessors? Same people who take care of the live living trees and who set the stability of the living trees. But the method of the hammer serves very well to establish the things. Same people can do that because responsibilities are similar and competencies are the same. those who manage trees, who are well versed about trees, dead or living trees, they have to decide about safety, about pruning, about, pollarding. They can establish all these facts and decide and provide advice. Do we have more questions? We have Sonata's opinion. She says it's a long, long road until perception that protection of dead wood and preservation is included in the long-term strategy of the development of infrastructure, and until some specific rules and legal acts appear. I'm not sure about that long road. We see examples in Sweden that single trees are protected, they are preserved, not based on rules. For example, there is an elm tree which was dry, and the bark was removed to remove the threat of pests, but it was left, and scientists from the university asked the municipality to leave that elm tree. So I think that we should do the same in Lithuania. We shouldn't have too many wars and much more dialogues, I would say. Yes, I agree. I understand, this question and concern hiding in it. In Soviet times, for decades, we had a negative attitude formed on the dead wood in general, both in forests and in urban areas. We have to change that through education, awareness raising, and denying all those false strategies. But we have to understand if for decades, people were being persuaded about that. Of course, there's no wonder that people have such attitudes. But we have to change through information boards, through education, that on the vice versa, leaving of the dead wood is good, not bad, but we need time because generations do not change so quickly. In the transitionary period, one of the potential solutions could be, maybe force and rules to set all that by rules. And if rules are missing, then, that depends on the wisdom of each person or based on his or her knowledge or on practice. But practices can be good or bad. I agree. We will need, many more years, maybe 100 years, because, in Smetona times, all wood would be collected for heating purposes, for practical purposes, and some forests seemed in those times or looked like contemporary parks. So situations are different in certain periods of times. But afterwards, it is very difficult to change our attitudes. But information is available, and we talk about the dead wood. We inform, we notify. So this is not so helpless, and educating, is good. Maybe more for young people, and maybe it will not help too much in terms of the elder generation of people. We should start from the young age. And if mother walks along the park and sees a dead wood falling down and would say, "Oh, see, this is a mess," and people in the municipality don't take care of that, so children will take it over, and they will, of course, think that the same way as their mothers do. And we, while performing works in regional parks, we know that we have Verkey Park, and we leave that dead wood as it fell down. We attach notices, and sometimes park workers take care of that. but they're afraid of the phone calls, of the complaints. But we said nothing to be done. This is the best place to show people because this is the city park. We have to show people good examples, and that there should be much of that Deadwood, that it is mandatory, obligatory. And it's much better for nature to have that mess. And if some people are still unhappy, they should contact us, Lithuanian Nature Fund. So I shouldn't be afraid, and I shouldn't advise to wait for decades. I should advise working now, informing directly, and impacting opinions of specialists so that there is as much as possible of that Deadwood in our urban areas. And our discussion perhaps is expiring. And therefore, I will thank Alvydas, Žydrūnas, and I will also thank those who, despite all shortcomings and other problems, technical problems, stayed with us. I received a very interesting experience. This is the first webinar. It had to be a conference, but since our speakers from Sweden understood that it would be complicated to arrive, so that was the first sign that we should render that real conference into the webinar. And you have to judge how well we succeeded. If you have any comments or suggestions, please write to Dalia, who registered all the people. And if you have more questions for Vikki or Uldis, you can write emails. We will provide you answers. And for now, I thank you for your attention. And the recording of the conference will be on our webpage, Osmoderma _LT. And I wish you a very beautiful remaining half of the day. Bye-bye.